I just want to start by welcoming Alex and Daniel. We're gathered here to celebrate the occasion of our second O.G.Rose course at Parallax. You guys are both prolific philosophers. Alex is a award-winning musician, but also seems like he's been captured by a bunch of young Hegelians of late. In any case, I wanted to talk about Daniel's book, and I guess we could start with this notion of belonging again, and what that means. What do we want to belong to? A home, a nation, family, religion. What is it? Or, the environment. Like, what are we nostalgic to belong again to? And so, if you don't mind, I'd like to just start on that notion.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. And Michelle and I had such a tremendous time at the last course. Look to the birds of the air in November. That was a ton of fun. And I'm thrilled to have a chance to speak with Alex Ebert. The last two conversations we had were tremendous. And I also very much enjoyed his recent conversation with Cadell, really showing the relevance, I think, of freak theory to political discussion. I think it was certainly extremely influential in Belonging Again and is incorporated and referenced often. So I'm very glad to have this opportunity. Belonging Again, the address is part 2 of a 2-book series so far that may just go on to infinitum, who knows. And part 1 really wants to talk about the problems with the sociological condition today, where basically you no longer have the possibility of belonging or a sense of roots that is based on givens. And what a given is, and this is inspired by the work of Philip Rieff, you can also think of Peter Berger, Hunter. A given is something that you don't think about. It's just given. And the moment you think about it, it doesn't work anymore because it works precisely because it's kind of thoughtless. So, for example, if you were born, say, in a Hindu society, Hindu is not an option. It's just how the world is. That's just how it is given, right? And there's a certain stabilization that occurs from that. As the world pluralizes, or as you get trade routes, globalization, all these things, really starting with, say, you could think, I locate a lot in the 18th century based on the works of, say, Dietrich McCloskey, The Great Enrichment, someone like Marx, et cetera, so forth, where you really start seeing this interconnection of the world. And as everything is interconnected, you start to go, wait a minute, there are other ways of living. I could have just as easily been born Christian or atheist or Islam. How do I know what I think is true? And there's a destabilization that occurs. What Philip Rieff will talk about is a release. You are kind of released from necessarily thinking that how you were born or your worldview is necessarily true. There's a great freedom in this, but there's also a great melancholia because there's a feeling of being lost from this givenness. Now, there's 2 ditches. This is what Philip Rieff talks about in The Triumph of the Therapeutic. In a world of givenness, you're prone to manipulation, thoughtlessness, or we could talk about the Hannah Arendt banality of evil, which is where evil becomes everyday. Like, evil is not something you choose. It's just, part of your routine, right? Well, that's really a problem, right? Like racism, xenophobia, and all those things are what you get from given. And very problematically, belonging for most of human history has been a source actually of exclusivity, insulation, racism, xenophobia, bifurcation, and atomization, right? Because that gives people a feeling of being in an interiority, to reference Mr. Ebert's work, that then creates a feeling of belonging. But of course, that's a doctrine of exclusion. So it's quite reasonable that at the end of the 20th century, after the horrors of, say, Nazism and all of these different forms, to then say, well, let's emphasize release, freedom from roots, freedom from sociological givens, which would then increase individual autonomy. It would increase individual choice, freedom, et cetera, so forth. But in so doing, what you end up doing is leading to what some people will talk about, say, nihilism, the meaning crisis, the lack of rooted, et cetera, so forth, right? Now, again, in that state of anxiety, it is extremely tempting to go back to old forms of belonging based on exclusivity, or to return to a nostalgic past, or to make the error of the release, which is we're going to make a utopia in the future that's better than everything. We're going to make a new world, et cetera, so forth. But of course, as comes out in freak theory, whenever you try to make a new world, it inevitably will fall back on dynamics of exclusion and inclusion, membranes, and so on and so forth. But then if you've simultaneously made that immoral, you exist in a sort of strange pathological relationship to the necessity of creating these boundaries so that you can have identity, and then you don't know what to do with them and you can't think them because you've actually created an ethical system where you're not allowed to think them. So there becomes all sort of pathologies that develop with that. So the question that belonging again, to bring it to a close, what belonging again too wants to ask, because there's a distinction at the end of part one between meaning and belonging. And there's a lot of argument to be made that I think what a lot of people will call is the meaning crisis. Meaning can actually make the problem of belonging worse. Because what I find meaningful, no one else around me may find meaningful. It may lead to atomization. It may lead to separation. And also human beings naturally do create meaning. I know Mr. Ebert in a presentation has mentioned this as well. Like, I create meaning all the time. The conspiracy is full of meaning. The QAnon is full of meaning, right? The issue that I understand, like if a Vervaeke or different people are talking about meaning, it's the notion of meaning that is not connected to a social recognition or a social order that, or isn't part of a social order that has a certain deconstruction of whatever meaning is created, right? Well, the moment you talk about that, you're talking about a sociological situation. And if you're talking about a sociological situation, you're talking about something like belonging, where you can feel like in your meaning, you have belonging in your community, you are recognized in your meaning, and your meaning simultaneously enhances or adds value to the people around you that they can participate in, and you get a feedback loop. So meaning and belonging are not the same, but human beings ultimately need both. And the issue is, if you provide belonging and not meaning, that may create all sorts of problems like the banality of evil that I was talking about. But if you have meaning without belonging, then you can have a certain thoughtlessness that can lead to all sorts of pathologies as well. But the moment, again, you talk about belonging, you are talking about economics, you are talking about politics, you are talking about society, you are talking about problems of scale, and you are talking about three things that we talk about: belonging, care, sustainability, and becoming. To have belonging, you have to feel like what you're doing is economically sustainable. You have to feel like you don't have to make trade-offs between your economic well-being and what you want to do. You have to feel like that you don't lose, say Dave talks about time energy, you don't have to lose all your time energy to do this sustainable thing. You also need to have care, feeling like people love you, people care about you, and that you're also able to engage what you care about. And then you also have to feel like you can become, kind of in the Hegelian sense, again, freak theory with the BE in parentheses, I put it sometimes, which is the notion that you can transform and become the person you want to become, or that you're becoming without losing your family. Because very often when we change, then, we alienate our family, right? So that leads to all sorts of different problems. You have to feel like you can transform without losing everything. But this is the overall point. The reason why belonging, again, is so difficult, as in a new way without givens, is because those three things tend to exist in conflict. Care tends to conflict with sustainability. What you care about tends to be something that's hard to get economic sustainability about. What is economically sustainable tends to be what is socially accepted, which tends to remove nuance and nuanced purpose. And then your becoming tends to have to be sacrificed in order to make yourself economically sustainable. So one of the reasons we don't have becoming again is because those three things also exist in tension. And historically, we haven't had to think that contradiction, though, because givens has made us not have to think about it. It's done the work for us. It's put it in the background. It's been something thoughtless. Now that givens have been destabilized under pluralism, we have to think those three things together. And that would kind of be the setup tension by which we would begin with belonging again. So those would be some thoughts that come to mind to start, Mr. Sweeny. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just before I pass it to Alex, couple of thoughts while you were speaking. Again, and I have the conversation between Cadell and Alex in mind about the givens that were kind of givens that get let's say turned upside down, for example, on the left and on the right. And the fact, and I was also thinking about Ebert's interest in the cool and what is cool today, and how we want to be cool, so we want to belong to something that's cool. And the weird thing is, what was not cool before, like Christianity and religion and all these sort of things that were super uncool, now become cool again. And so what is that? Is that what's going on there? And what does that have to do with like the more deep questions of belonging? Does that give you something to work with, Alex?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. It's great to hear you outline it, Daniel, and thanks for having me on. One thing I should just say that's always impressed me about Daniel's approach and is almost curious in the scope of the behavior of most philosophers is his willingness to reference his peers.
Mm.
And there is a sense of inherent belonging that occurs with the sort of magnanimity of that willingness. We tend to want to reference the big names and the more opaque philosophers and so on, and to sort of give ourselves a sense of gravitas and grasp of history. But Daniel's willingness to reference myself, for instance, or any number of peers, almost as if he's not weighting anyone with any. There's no historical weighting going on. The weights are all designed to refer to the power of a given thought, according to him, and the usefulness of a given thought. It seems to be the only ideational weights that he's applying to his references, and I find that that's very I hesitate to say inclusive, but it is. There's something magical about that, and there's something that creates a sense of belonging and a sense of interiority of the present moment in and amongst, I think, the philosophers that he and thinkers that he interacts with. And his hosting of this weekly show, weekly Zoom call, The Net, is a pretty good example or exemplar of a building interiority.
Can I just add something to that? Because I had the exact same thought. And it also occurred to me when I was reading his book and finding myself referenced and you referenced and so many people we know referenced in this book, that this might be a new sort of literature that is emerging, a new kind of writing of philosophy. Whereas it's more immediate and it's equally as rigorous as many of the other philosophers, but it's also much more congenial and much less inframed by the academic world.
Yeah, there's a liberty. There's an inherent sort of liberation from the constraints of academia in referencing your peers, especially peers who have not grabbed all the preferred accolades and the PhDs and so on. And so I think that there's a courage there, but also I almost see it the way Daniel, and now speaking about you while you're here in third person, but the way you seem to approach this this process of reference, thankfully, seems to me to be undergone in an almost sort of like autistic carelessness, where it's almost like you're not giving consideration to history because or to the historical weight of monumental thinkers, not because you're choosing not to, and that this is a choice, but because it is just the natural mode of your being, which is a mode that would be totally asymmetrical to the bulk of philosophical thinkers who want to prove their intellect by referencing other relatively well-known intellects. And so I really admire that. I think it is very liberating and inspiring, and it creates a sense of belonging that you can feel and is palpable in the book. If you're one of those referenced, and even if you're not, I think you're right, Andrew. There's a sort of phenomenology to the writing of Daniel, which feels inherently inclusive because you have this sense, I think you would even get the sense that he's referencing his contemporaries in a way that points to an interiority that you're not a part of. And that's the most powerful form of interiority. It's what creates FOMO, and it's what creates a sense of longing to belong, right? And that's one of the, probably the most powerful. And I've thought a lot about that impulse to belong, because it's not immediately a biological imperative. We don't have an immediate biological trigger like hunger you know, like horniness, to belong. Both hunger and horniness tend to group us into groupings because it's easier to get food when you're with people and so on, and it's easier to fuck if you have people around. But loneliness, or that sense of like longing for an interiority, is a much less distinct sensation in terms of its immediate gratification, because it's not so obvious, because not all interiors are created equal. There's a lot of groups that hang out, people that are all friends, that I don't want to be a part of. Like, yes, if I'm on my like my last ropes, I guess, you know, like I'll take a bagel from you, but I don't want to hang out with everybody or with all interiors. So not all interiors are created equal. And that's the beauty of belonging. We gravitate toward interiorities which seem to resonate. And either they resonate because there's a one-to-one isomorphic resonance between our own interiority and the interiority we're searching for. So that could be it. We're searching for a larger version of ourselves. Like Seinfeld said, I found the woman of my dreams. It's me, you know, because they did everything the same and they liked all the same music and they went out and danced in the same ways and so on. And you find that with relationships a lot. You tend to gravitate toward people that you get along with because you enjoy the same things, like an extension of self. So those are one variety of interiority. The other variety of interiority are the folks that you think might push you, or that you seem to have some aura that you would like to have, you know. In AA, there's a whole like rubric around, you know, you pick a sponsor who has what you want, but you don't have. Do you know what I mean? There are all sorts of interiorities that we long to belong to. Ultimately, though, you know, to boil it down to what we're actually after is the saturated interiority itself, I think, which is basically phenomenologically the experience of love, the experience of being safe, the experience of being within an interior that is not being currently threatened, in which all needs are being met and so on, and in which you feel swaddled, coddled, and so on. And, you know, a lot of people would balk against that, right? Especially in a sort of independently minded Western society where we're like, well, what you're describing is a return to the womb, and that's childish. And what you need to do is adultify and become an individual and individuates to such an extent that you realize there is never going to be an interiority that coddles and swaddles you. But that's actually not phenomenologically true. What's true is that sense of interiority or love doesn't last. But that lack of duration does not make it any less true. In fact, the temporal quality of a saturated interior is precisely its eternalness. Its saturated relation suspends chronological time and gives you a sense of the kairotic moment. And that's what's so fucking attractive about even getting a glimpse of that sort of sense of belonging, right? So anyway, all that to say that I think the question of belonging is it's not only important and it's not only emblematic of our times and, you know, and what we're searching for and so on, but it also describes the teleonomic end state that we all either furtively or explicitly wish to arrive at. You see it happening everywhere. In fact, as I think one of the best descriptions of the current sort of like intellectual sphere, and that would include everything from life coaches to men's groups to whatever, to this, is that all you see are people being like, we need to get together. Let's get together. Let's form this group. Let's do a that thing. Let's do a this course. All of these things. And, you know, in one of conversation with Daniel, I was like, what are we actually doing when we get together and doing these things? Like, what are we doing? We're problematizing. We're doing all these things. We're doing this philosophy. But what's underneath it? And I think it was Jockin who was like, we're trying to be friends. That's actually what it's about, being together. All we're trying to do, the reason we even got on this call, I was excited, is to hang out with people that I have something that I'm excited to talk about. But it's less the thing that I'm excited to talk about and more the hanging out. There's a subsistent drive to belonging that is very much related to what I call static drive. So I think it's in a lot of ways the fundamental force of the universe. And we can see this with whether it's atoms clumping together to form fucking planets, or us clumping together to form in groups. And so this question, and then I'll pass it back to you, this question of, well, how do we have an interior that isn't also exclusionary? I don't believe you can, but I don't believe that that is the point. Like, I don't think that the transcended approach to belonging is that belonging which does not exclude. I think interiority necessitates exteriority, and that exteriority is disincluded. And the only way to have an interior is to have a disequilibrium. You can't have it all. But the transcendent approach, I suppose, and I think to me, and maybe this is what you're getting at with belonging again, is that there is an understanding of the metalogical process of interiority, exteriority, that allows us not to supercharge the process with superfluous emotional sort of power that lead to something like sort of xenophobia, fundamentalism, where you're trying to preserve the interiority, or where all you want to do is escape any sort of sublated state, and so on. And to realize rather that the dialectic entails both the dynamic oppositional interplay or oscillation, and then the collapse of that oscillation into an inert interiority, which can seem non-dynamical, and yet a non-dynamism, which isn't necessarily bad, even though it seems to be antithetical to vitality, but a non-dynamism which describes the very inert interiority of love. And then we're off again. And that this dialectic isn't simply happening on a historical, decades level, but is happening also all the time while we're thinking, and going from the amygdala to the anterior cingulate cortex, going from fight, flight, and fear to pattern matching, and back and forth, which is basically going from a conservative to a liberal. We have all that baked within our mental operations. And anyway, but I'm curious though, Daniel, with regard to belonging again, in this problem of exclusion and interiors and exteriors and so on, where you're currently thinking with regard to that.
Magnificent. And first, thank you both for the very kind words. That really means a lot. So thank you. What you just said there is extremely good. So when I was mentioning exclusion, what I mean by that, because you need a kind of sublation of it that entails the old, but in a new way. Because there's a way in which when I define something, there's an exclusion, but also definition is necessary for the possibility of definition, for a thing to be itself, right? So there's a difference between definition and exclusion. And politically, exclusion, for me, I'm not saying always, language is tricky, right? Like exclusion is where I go, okay, I'm white, you're black, I'm better than you, you're kicked out. I'm American, you're the other country. There's an exclusion that is based on an active us versus them dynamic that is actually based more so on a kind of architecting and intentional designing of the exclusion that is based actually problematically on something, and then I'll explain what I mean by this, on something that was given. You're just born white, right? You're just born Christian. You're just born whatever, right? And so most of history, belonging, the exclusivity, because you're exactly right, there's something like exclusivity necessary for belonging. For most of history, that exclusivity was provided by blood, family, nationality, wealth, occupation, something like that. Which then, the problem with that is, of course, it is by birth or by your connections, you can't get in or out, right? It's not enough of a membrane. I know there's the language of membrane, right, which has this ability of definition, but you can also pass through it, right? what does a membrane, it's one thing to talk about membranes philosophically. What does membrane look like political economy? What would it look like to have an education that is trying to create membrane relationships, which would also get into questions of friendship that are not merely based on, because here's the other problem. We're in a kind of friend session. I've heard the phrase used in the book Lost Connections, which is the notion that people don't have friends. If you ask the average American, how many close friends do you have? It's gone from like 6 to 1 or 0 for most people, right? Because it turns out that most friendship in history was based on givens. Like they go to church with you, or they go to like Robert Putnam talks about bowling alone, right? So givens were something bestowed more so by an external environment rather than actively cultivating the conditions to engage in people in a special way. Like I feel the exact same way. You would, like Jock had mentioned, friendship and coming on a call like this. It's wow, I'm hanging out with people I love and that we can interact and talk about things we normally can't. And there's a special interiority in that. But what's very interesting about that interiority, I would certainly say probably nobody here ran into an environment that, say, encouraged them to jump on the liminal web or to read philosophy. In fact, a lot of people thought, maybe have said you were wasting your time. If you're not going, oh, are you going to be a college professor? No. Then you're crazy. Like the external environment can actually be very offish to the kind of philosophy that is being done here or the kind of community that is being done, right? And so it's not bestowed. There's a certain internal conditioning, and I'm not saying it's purely atomistic. You probably met people, you read things. I'm not saying there is no relationality at all, but it's probably a relationality that was not so much bestowed by the socioeconomic condition. Because of how the world is right now. But because of that conditionality you have, you are able to create a certain interiority here that is, it has the same effect as the bowling clubs that Robert Putnam talks about, and yet its existence comes into existence in a very different way than the Robert Putnam sort of bowling place. It is not necessarily provided. Now, there's the infrastructure of Zoom, obviously, but you see something emerging that is very interesting. And it's interesting to also see, like right here, the interiority that is being formed here. It doesn't have the same character as classical interiorities, where we say, oh, we're getting together because we're all American. We're getting together because we all have the same beliefs. We're getting together because of some given, right? We're getting together because, it has a lot to do with philosophy. It has a lot to do with ideas in a certain mode of talking. It's far more skill-based now. There's something that seems to have a lot more of a skill, and it has a lot more to do with something that is internally cultivated, that then actually allows you to create a communal interiority that otherwise would not be possible. So here's the kind of point. For belonging to be possible today, that does not fall back on nostalgic forms of belonging that are more based on an exclusion from givens. You need an exclusion that is based on things like skills, based on ideas, based on more things that are a result of shared reference and the ability to engage with one another in a manner that makes the other person feel like they get you, but in terms of something that you deeply worked on. Because then the thing that happens with that is it's not the same feeling of most exclusivity, and then I'll close the point. Most exclusivity in history has come with a feeling of injustice. Like you say, okay, and that's why belonging has rightfully been the classical notion of belonging has been rightly deconstructed, because it mostly contributes to injustice, right? I'm white, you're black, so I'm better than you. Well, that's injustice, so we destroy that. I have money, you don't, I'm better than you. Okay, well, no, that's not good. That gets into class dynamics. So there's this notion of those forms of exclusivity being unjust. But when I personally see someone who's a really good skateboarder, or I see someone who is really committed to a certain skill, I don't feel like an injustice because I could develop that ability, but that's just simply not what resonates with me, right? And so they're able to form an interiority based on a certain commitment, a certain giving themselves over to something that creates an interiority without it being the same dynamics of injustice that has formulated throughout most of history. And this gets into one of the things that's happened. A lot of these interiorities, so that people classically accepted them, required the maintaining of a social contract, like a general social contract, where people believed, hey, if I'm in the middle class, you're in the upper class, you're in the lower class. Well, the system is fair. So these different classes are actually a testament to justice because they reflect people's work ethic, right? Well, if that turns out not to be true, well, then that social contract breaks down, and those interiorities, those divisions come to feel like injustices, right? And that the system needs to be changed, right? And so what you have now is you still have an education system basically contributing to the formation of interiorities that no longer have a social contract to back them. You have people who are being kind of socially habituated to engage in using their free time in a manner that doesn't give them different options of interiority, because they say, don't, you know, Ivan Illich talks about disablement, that we live in a disabled society, where if you say, for example, to make that, if you said, I want to build my own home, like I want to learn how to make furniture, you're seen as a deviant. Why would you do that when you can go to the store and build it and buy it, right? Why? And actually you're arrogant to think that you can do it better than an expert, right? Like any sort of development of skill or capacity outside of wage labor that you're getting paid for is seen as deviant and discouraged, right? And yet the thing that we're pointing at is like, you know, we're not teaching at a college university, but there's a certain development of a skill of philosophy or conversation that because you have that, you are able to form interiorities and feeling of belonging that are different in character from classical forms of belonging that are based on exclusivity. But if developing those kind of capacities of which are necessary for belonging are seen as deviant or discouraged by the society, either directly or indirectly, then these options of belonging are not available at scale for the majority of people. And so those would be some of the ways I would describe it, where you're certainly still having a form of exclusivity, but it is a definition that is a product of, say, a long-term mediation, the development of a skill or a commitment. And then what that would actually allow is lots of people would choose lots of different things to commit to, and then you'd have like diversity. You'd actually have a diversity that was based on the commitment, not a diversity that was simply based on a state or a given or something that was just granted. Because if you do that, just to your point with Cadell, you get stuck going back and forth forever, right? Because, and that's kind of a key logic that you're bringing out in your work, in my opinion, Mr. Ebert, is that eventually conservatism saturates into liberalism, to use American language, liberalism eventually saturating conservative back and forth. Basically, all classical forms of belonging based on givens, as I was saying classically, do that. That's always going to happen. And if you want to, say, move beyond that into the sublation, not just be stuck in the dialectic, but actually see it to its completion, you'd have to engage in something like this form of membrane that is based on commitment, absolute choice, and skill, which would be which you would commit to precisely because you are aware that things eventually saturate into their other. Once you know that, you say, wow, we have to think of something alternative. And then you're going to consider these alternative like forms of belonging again, or belonging based of memory. But that's why, say, freak theory is so important, because once you're aware of that, then you say, oh, what could I do to actually then keep the good of that, but sublate it, keep the old, but in a new way? Something like we're seeing here is what would need to be engaged in, something like this sort of process. So those would be some thoughts.
Just a quick jumping in with a couple queries and observations. It occurs to me that one of the reasons that maybe we are getting together, because as Alex was saying, we have a longing, right, to be friends, is because we're outsiders in some kind of a way. I mean, even if people are highly successful, like Alex, and in some domain, it seems like everybody I know is an outsider, or everybody that I'm interested in is a hybrid being of some kind. It's not ever anybody on the straight and narrow who has has some kind of perspective that is transparent, that I can understand, and this is this person. There's a mystery to this. There's a tension often in that longing. There's a loneliness. There's all of this pathos, but it's in a way that it's the longing to belong again is because you don't belong. Anyway, that was just some of my thoughts here.
Well, and I'll just add quickly, I think that there is certainly a certain outsider thing. And I should note that if everyone were to indeed engage in something like the belonging of the liminal web that could have different forms with different people, then you may reach an age where the other side has to be taken into account based on freak theory. But this is where Hegel would emphasize the now, what is the now? And then when we saturate that, we'll take care of the next thing. And, you know, to always be careful to be thinking too far ahead, because yeah, that's how history works. You eventually reach the point of the saturation where you need to consider the other. In my opinion, looking at the political economy, and how we're at the age of needing to have a form of belonging that is not based on givens, which is really freaking hard to think. And basically, if you can't do that, the only given you have is the logic of the economy, or, you know, capital, or the Washington consensus, which is failing. Now I have to make that argument, and hopefully the book does. But if it is failing, that means you have to find belonging in a different way, or you're going to have pathological responses. And the thing that I was describing is what I would situate as what would be an address of this historic moment. But I think that point was very well put, Andrew.
Great. I have a bunch of notes here. Just to respond to what Andrew was saying just now. I mean, as far as my studies go, the more asymmetrical a group of belonging, the more powerful and meaningful the membership. And this holds true pretty much across the board. It doesn't really matter if we're talking about airline points medallion members. Like, it's better to be a diamond Delta member than a gold member. Like, it's better to be in the VIP section than just in the club, and definitely better to be in the club than outside the club, and so on, where most of the people are standing and most of the city lives. And then better even than the VIP section is the manager's office, where everyone's doing blow and fucking sticking dildos down their throats or whatever. The more these hierarchies of belonging are nested, and they're nested in sort of concentric circles. The more asymmetrical does not necessarily mean the more outside. It can also mean the further at the center.
Well, it's almost the same, isn't it? If I could just jump in, like, I always feel like the outside is the center. You know,
Yeah.
That's where things are really happening. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's this comes back to a lot of my stuff on Cool, but just in terms of membranes, and if the very last membrane is the membrane between humanity and rude nature, and you have society at the largest rung, and then inside society you have one group, then another group, and so on, and you have these nested hierarchies of belonging. Well, the safest place is to be at the very, very center of the center of the center of the center. So that if you get kicked out of that center, well, at least now you're just in the VIP section. You get kicked out of the VIP section, you're still in the club. Now, you don't want to be kicked out of the club, but then at least you're still in the city. But then you get kicked out, and so on and so forth. And so that there's really no end to the nesting of these hierarchies, and we seem to constantly want to crack off and create an even more asymmetrical club, which is why if our club grows too large, we'll be like, nah, fuck them. We have a new club, and it's this other thing. We still kind of belong. I'm still a card-carrying member of that thing, but now we're in this thing, and so on. Yes, I like punk rock, but are you really into like a very specific niche version of punk rock? Yes, I like this album. Yeah, but have you heard their demos? Did you hear their early shit? It's always this question of levels of discretion. Let's see. Okay, so back to this idea of givens. I can't help but think that, so what you're describing, there are sort of instituted givens that run ramshod over what we might call true givens, which would be the sort of the givens of desire, the subjective givens that we may be born with, that may manifest in a myriad of ways, but that we have to assume that one of the reasons we're here right now isn't because we suddenly decided to be here, apropos of nothing, but because there is a historical, personal, subjective process which has led us here, and that subjective historical process was always guided by a set of subjective givens. Now, those subjective, or let's say like the givens of desire, or let's say true givens, were always mingling and being coerced by institutional givens. And institutional givens meaning everything from the linguistic paradigm you're born into, to the family, to the state, and so on. And so you have these institutional givens and then these true givens. And they're always interfacing. And to some extent, we can't always parse them apart, of course, right? Nature, nurture. But we do know now, and if I think anything, that the newest sort of forms of thought, both on the left and right, but more on the right at the moment, but I think the left really has to grapple with this, is that nurture isn't everything, and that nature actually does count for something. And one of the things we're referring to when I say true givens is an essentialization of the subject. And now it's dangerous to essentialize institutional givens, where we say, well, because you were born this way, you are essentially, not contingently, but essentially and necessarily better than X, Y, and Z, and you necessarily belong here. That's not only unfair to the people that are on the exterior of the given institution, but it's actually even more fair to the people on the inside of it, because what you're doing is running roughshod over their own true givens and suppressing and flattening those in service of whatever institution. And so if we juxtapose sort of like institutional givens and subjective givens or true givens, what we end up having to deal with, which I think is dangerous territory only in the context of sort of a progressivism which has sort of in a Rousseauian hyperbolic state decided that there is no nature. It's pure nurture. We are all just blank slate, tabula rasa, and everything about us is vis-a-vis education and exposure to environment. But we know, of course, that that's not true, right? We know that that's not true because we have myriad studies that suggest that that's not true. And one of the things that, of course, we seem to inherit, like if you have kids, which I know you do, Daniel, and Andrew, do you have kids?
Yeah, sure do.
Yeah.
Two
Okay.
kids.
So you see, and this happens with twins too, right? They're very different, and they just come out different. It's not like you exposed one to one weird thing and another to really normal shit.
Radically different as well.
Yeah, and they're just like radically different because they're radically different. There's really no explanation other than they were born with some true givens that are differentiated from one another and are simply different. Now, when conservative brains have been studied and they have more gray matter in the amygdala, and a liberal brain is being studied, it has more gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, I find that fascinating. Of course, we both have amygdalas and anterior cingulate cortexes. One is for pattern matching, which makes sense with the liberal, right? All of a sudden, I think, well, they're just like me, right? Everything is a fucking metaphor. And I relate to everything. And if you let that go off the rails, well, that's psychotic, right? Because then everything is your interiority. There is no distinguishing characteristic between you and another. We're all the same. I can find equal ground and equal footing with anything and anyone. And then it leads to an extreme relativism, right? Where all of a sudden there is no good and bad, everything is relativized. Now that's typically psychotic. But then on the other hand, if you let the amygdala get out of control and it's like holding on, everything is fear-based and fight, flight, and freeze, well, then you're extreme neurotic and you're holding on to everything and you're an identitarian and you can't stop with that. Now, ironically, a lot of our liberals today are actually identitarian conservatives. They just have the name liberal. So anyway, all that to say that if we bring it back to sort of subjective givens or true givens, I don't know which one we like. Essential givens, the givens of desire, the essentialization of our desires. What that basically leads us to confront is that some of us are born in some ways with certain desires and drives, and others with other desires and interests and drives, and that those are not entirely circumstantial, but they are essential. And that there is an essentialized quality to the atomized, and this leads us to positivize the very pluralistic atomization of the world. So that, okay, yes, we're all different. We're all individuals. Okay, now what? Well, it turns out that some of us like being in weird ass little fucking philosophy cults, and others of us like listening to fucking Taylor Swift, and others of us here and there. And of course, again, this all interfaces with institutional givens and indoctrination and ideology and so on. However, they're in competition with each other, and it's again hard to parse. But at the very least, we know and can tell that if we're doing something that is typically, as Daniel pointed out, not economically optimal, or we're doing something that is not socially optimal in terms of status aggregation, then we're probably doing something that has more to do with a true given, right? Because the incentive structure is not there to validate our behavior.
We're driven by a real Damien or a real passion.
Exactly. There's a real diamond there. And so then when we think about belonging, what we're looking for, of course, in this postmodern sort of world is our tribe. I found my people, to be like Burning Man about it. Like, these are my people. He's my person. Like, and I think we're already doing that, right? We have this sense of like an uprooted, unlocalized sense of the hunt for family, or like Fast and Furious, like, family, like nothing fucks with family, like, and this idea of like, well, they're not family and they're not blood relatives, but they found their family. So, and home is whenever I'm with you, wherever I'm with you. It doesn't have to, it's the you-ness. It's that I found you. And so we already have that paradigm, and that's working. Like, people understand this idea. So we're not inventing anything there, but I think the invention has to do more, in my mind, or the thing I'm excited about at the moment, is this idea of a true given, which necessarily makes us confront science and have to incorporate the actual reality that some of us are born different. And you hear the right talking at the moment about an aristocracy of the spirit, right? And that we need to bring back aristocracy, but it's like an aristocracy of spirit. Not even that we need to bring it back. We need to just recognize that some people are like, like blah, blah, blah here, and they're better at this and better at that and so on.
That was D.H. Lawrence's phrase, I think. Yeah.
Was it? Okay. Yeah. And so, yeah. And I think that is a really, really seemingly innocuous but very deep and impactful thing to have to grapple with, is the idea of a true given or a subjective given, and obvious, and I think it's obviously in the works. But if we unpack that, maybe we actually will be able to get to a place where we can. Because here's the thing, I guess what I really want to like just wrap this up by saying that if I know that a group to which I'm attracted, or an interiority which I am creating, is not merely a happenstance of my environmental upbringing, but is an essential feature of my subjective drive, the amount of meaning I can experience from belonging to that group is exponentially greater, because I will realize that this is where I belong. It is not where I happen to belong. It is where I belong in essential terms. And that's always the feeling that we're after. And you could say, well, that's a superficial cocktail of sort of emotions in your brain, but the real world effects of having that superficial cocktail of emotion in your brains is that as a group, you end up behaving much differently, because you feel that this is an essential feature of your being. And you can see this in religions that treat themselves as essentialized, especially Jewish people. But I was thinking, Hasidic or the other one's escaping me. But when you really feel like, we are actually the chosen people, it makes you behave in a way that is a little fundamentally different. Now, that's not my favorite tool. And in fact, I find that to be quintessentially a institutional given, right? That runs roughshod over your subjective givens, because I personally do believe that we are more or less, like, as we said, our children born to our blood, we can see on a one-to-one correspondence, are totally different than one another. So it has to be the case that within any given institutional given, There are a plurality of idiosyncratic difference and wills, of subjective wills that are longing to find the very group to which they belong in their subjective givens, with regard to their subjective givens, and yet they're denied those belongings. So anyhow, yeah, little silver lining, I suppose, in the atomization game.
Well, there was a question I had, when you and Cadell were talking about the fact that, and Cadell was making the point that we should become religious, do what religious people do better than what religious people do. He made that point, and I was thinking, but how would you do that without a deep connection to to an actual lineage of religion? Like, how would you do that without going into the dangers of some kind of Rousseauian, like, utopianism? It was just a thought I had, but I hear you. Like, I think there are different lineages, and some lineages are lineage is of black sheep, and other lineages are a lineage of sheep. There's different styles, and different lineages. Anyway, do you want to?
Everything's so
can
magnificent.
I'm sure you have a few things to
It's
say.
absolutely magnificent. So there's a few things.
On this idea that, the term givens is sociological. So when sociological givens, there's a certain absolute skepticism, David Hume may say, or you can also say this kind of abyssal opening. Peter Berger says we're all existentialists now because that things could be given. But this is what's interesting. You actually, in that opening, and this is where it's an opportunity, because of sociological givens giving out, the term I've used sometimes is determinisms, the determinations, like what can actually come to the forefront are the true givens. We'll use that language because I like that. Once the artificial givens go away, the true givens come out. And this is where also I think the emphasis on encounter and limit is very important for freak theory, because the true given is found in encounter more than I think that's a true given. Like, that's what I would like. This is what opens up. You encounter what is given. You encounter what is given in experience, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, if you have the right philosophy, and you could say that the religion that, the religio binding, what we need to bind ourselves to is the encounter versus a philosophical premise. Like religions, David Hume makes a distinction between, dare I say, good philosophy, bad philosophy. He also talks about false philosophy and true philosophy. I like to think about, like, basically bad religion, good religion, bad economics, good economics. I can keep going. And the difference is basically a philosophical grounding for the field versus a concrete encounter in the field, which would bring up the language of limits, for example. So when David Hume talks about common life, what he means is that philosophy ultimately has to be in service of an encounter, of a lived experience, of a life that you have in common life with other people, because they're the test of your ideas. So, for example, when you have an idea of what Sarah likes, David Hume would say, no. You need to go encounter Sarah and then come up with ideas in that encounter. And then that will primarily be probably a negation. You'll probably find out that your good ideas are wrong, right? So he wants to make the experience first and then the ideas. But he says the modern man, here's the problem. When we encounter the abyssal nature of reality, absolute skepticism, our tendency is to run from the other to our ideas, not to encounter the other and then think. And he says that's the characteristic that is very dangerous. In speaking of the Scottish Enlightenment, that could lead to all sorts of problems. And I think he's correct on that. And so likewise, and what ends up happening is when you have an opportunity to encounter true givens, which then if we go to Hegel, like Cadell has been teaching on the philosophy of right, is the notion that freedom is only found when you can locate oughtness in isness. When the divide between is and ought is removed, and you actually, what ought to be is what is equals ought in a way, right? That's freedom. That by definition means there has to be a true given. There has to be an isness. If there is no isness, there is no isness you can identify oughtness with. And so freedom is no longer possible. And this is something to go to what, like Peter Beager, and then I'll give it to you, Mr. Sweeny. What Mr. Reef understood is that human beings that try to have pure release or pure freedom, meaning there are no true givens at all, end up going nuts. And so what he's trying to locate, he's like, okay, we're in a world that has no sociological givens, and we thought that would be great. But it turns out that if you give people pure freedom, they go nuts because they don't know what to choose. They have no standard of choice. So we need to bring back something like givens. And Peter Reef, in my opinion, Mr. Reef ends his book with an explanation and not an address. So you can say belonging again is like, if this is so, what all the sociologists are saying, what would address this condition where it turns out sociological givens are oppressive, but then also pure release or pure no givens at all also is bad? What does it look like to deal with the middle of that, if you will? And I think it has something to do with true givens. But Mr. Sweeny, please.
Sorry, you guys are so rich in ideas that there's like each time you speak, I have about 10 things that I don't want to miss. But when the is becomes an ought, and that seems to be this intense moment of when things are the most alive. I wanted to distinguish that between like the Freudian infantile, state of just sucking on your mother's breast, because there's an intelligence in that. So I always like when the mystical experience is described as some kind of oceanic bliss without intelligence, where you're back in the infantile state. I think that's wrong. I think that the next stage of that is when, as you say, when the is becomes an ought, that there's a moment where eros combines with let's say intelligence. Does that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and I'll just say quickly, what humans are optimal in, if you grant me that language, is incredibly similar to what they're worst in. You know, the Ivan Illich idea that the best of things as the inverse is the worst of thing. Like we were speaking at the net, like, so there's something about belonging that requires something automatic, an ability to operate with thoughtlessness. But then thoughtlessness is also what leads to fundamentalism. Very similar, but difference in quality. But from a certain ontological perspective, they're actually the similar, like isomorphic, really.
Like
right?
the sublime and the terror at the.
Yes. Like you had this notion, like speaking of some religions, the notion that God is the ultimate beauty and reduces you to ash at the same time, right? Like there's this weird mixture, right? So for most of history, again, when I think about the notion of a problematic oceanic, a problematic state of kind of saturation, it's the automatism that has not gone through the crucible of philosophy. Like it has not gone through the process of separation. But but here's the thing, you're actually, the automatic then needs the philosophical to separate into active thought, which is then incredibly difficult. But then it needs to return to what I call auto-mastery. So, which is actually a form of interiority, like Mr. Ebert is saying, that is like the banality of evil, that is like this kind of form where there's no difference, but it's what leads to nationalism. But it actually has gone through philosophy. So let me put it this way. Like David Hume, you could say we all start with belonging, okay? Everyone starts with belonging. But it's the belonging that is a result of the lack of philosophy. It is a result of just being born and this is your family and you don't think about anything. And there is a very real, profound interiority that is oceanic, that is wonderful. That's why so many people want to go back to childhood. And a lot of people, of course, people have different stories, but there's a feeling of being born into that. What ends up happening, what David Hume would call the philosophical ascent, is when you actually begin to differentiate from your family, or you have the idea that doesn't align with what your parents believe. But here's the funny thing. Philosophy makes it possible to have meaning, because when you had belonging and it was thoughtless, you couldn't tell the difference between belonging and meaning. They were like Schrodinger, they were like really together, like this. And actually you conflated belonging and meaning. Meaning requires you have to make your belonging meaningful, which means you have to choose it and think about it. Oh, but wait, isn't thinking about it exactly what ruins the belonging? Isn't that precisely what pulls you out of the state of interiority? Like Ebert will talk about consciousness, like we're actually working to get it to the subconscious, right? Like that's where, and consciousness is moving that way. Exactly. If you stay in the subconscious, Without moving into the conscious, then you could be manipulated, you can end up a Nazi, you can end up in fundamentalism, and so on and so forth. But if you move into consciousness and philosophical thought, that's precisely what can lead to nihilism, meaning crisis, not connected, anxiety, and all these different things. But this is where when David Hume talks about the return to common life, or Hegel talks about the return, or different things like that, what that is a philosophical belonging, or a meaningful belonging, which is a possibility of thought that has to be active, that separates you from the original oceanic per se, that separates you from the original automatic, that then makes possible as a sublation an auto-mastery, that makes possible this deep, meaningful belonging that Mr. Ebert is talking about, which is actually what I think a lot of people are talking about today, whether they know it or not. They're talking about a meaning-infused belonging. They are talking about a belonging that is a process of a separation that then you return to, but in a new way. But that is going to be a belonging that is not based on traditional sources of givens, but is actually going to be based on chosen givens, true givens that you then identify with and you integrate with, where is becomes ought together. Because another way to put it, the problem is, without philosophy, it's almost like you start off in is with ought in parentheses, because it's what ought to be, because it's all you know. Once you move into philosophy, it's possible for you to determine what ought to be, because you can think, you can use philosophy, but then of course you can just deconstruct what is, because it's not living up to ought. What you have to do is move to the place where is equals ought. Like they come together because you move through the thought, which is incredibly difficult, but that is precisely the possibility of a belonging that doesn't fall back on the problematic nationalisms or the infantile oceanic that doesn't develop into auto-mastery.
Maybe just being stuck in mere language. Like I often feel like the philosophers often get lost in language, like, you know, mountains are mountains and then they're not mountains and rivers, you know, this Zen phrase, mountains and mountains and mountains and rivers are mountains and rivers, then they're not mountains and rivers, then are mountains and rivers again. So the belonging again is the third stage of that, and many people get lost in the valley, you know, of words, of mere language, of language without being able to attach language to you know, pure givens, I guess is the language we're using here. Anyway, Alex.
Absolutely, which would it's like you start in the town, you go to the ivory tower per se. Hume's like, you must go back to the town, or must go back to a quote unquote given, so you can encounter people to see that your language that you learned and that you're really impressed with doesn't match. Maybe it's helpful, but it's not the sum. And so you go to the place of challenge per se. You go to the place of encounter where you encounter the limits. Otherwise, you're stuck in language. I think that's well put. Please.
No, I'm just sitting here thinking about this, you know, very important. Again, it's the monk or drunk conundrum.
Yes.
The fundamentalist versus the oceanic interiority. And there may be a sleight of language that we've been using that has led to this problem. Or it may be a genuine problem. The question, of course, has to do with automaticity and relating automaticity to, well, for me in freak theory, relating automaticity to saturation, the saturated interior. And I don't necessarily know that they are absolutely coupled. One thing that we, you know, to put everything I think you guys have been saying in slightly different terms, in terms of this working through the negativity of things. You know, this is classically the way the brain, I'll stop moving this around, the way the brain functions when it's encountering problematicity or a problem or really a prediction error. So we have these worlds that we've built, and you know, let's say it's an institutional given, and it's like, this means this, this means this, this means that, that's this is how you do this, this is how you do this, this is how you do this, this is your world, go. And our subjective givens are not given a moment to breathe, and so far we start off and we don't encounter limit. What we encounter, actually, ironically, is pure automaticity, because every conceivable aspect of our environment has been given. And and we don't encounter prediction errors. Now, let's say all of a sudden, you know, your world is supposed to be blue, and so you're like, okay, everything's blue. All of a sudden, you see something that's orange. Well, there's a prediction error. We encounter this all the time, right? We're constantly weighting prediction errors, deciding if they're sufficient errors or if we're encountering them enough that we need to either accommodate them, which would mean to create basically a new schema which says orange. Okay, now I know there's something out there called orange, and I'm gonna now that's in my schema, and now that's automatic. Or we just assimilate them because they were all not different enough. So it's like, that's a different looking cup of water, but it's just a cup of water. And so it's not sufficiently problematic. And in this process, we're constantly doing the thing where we take the alien otherness and we work it through the processes and into the state of interiority. So we're constantly sort of acquiring ulteriority or the alien and processing it through and making it internal. And in that way, basically, the very process of cognition is the acquiring of otherness and the acquisition of the external to produce an increasing span of interiority. And in a lot of ways, that's why the more we know, the more stable and comfortable we feel with the world up to a certain point of saturation, beyond which we may be like, oh shit, I now know too much. And now I'm confused. And then, these are the moments of encounter that I think Daniel's talking about, is that it's through the process of the given drives and interests and desires that we encounter true limits or limits that are available to us only by dint of our own exploration. And the grand surprise of that, it's like, I know that I'm going to become a master piano player at some point, but the surprise is I just don't know when that's going to be, if ever. But I don't know when it's going to be. It could be tomorrow, or it could be when I wake up tomorrow. I come back to the piano. I'm like, oh shit, I improved. We've all had that moment where it's very suddenly we improve at something that we hadn't known that we had reached the limit until the next time we approached the thing. Anyway, so that sort of strategy is always happening with regard to the topic at hand and belonging and so on. And fundamentalism versus, the oceanic. I want to say basically that the preservation, which negates the problematicity, so it negates the encounter with the thing that is not readily accommodated, and refuses accommodation. So you have your schema, you have all your givens, and then you encounter orange, and then you say, no, I'm not going to accommodate that. And everyone tells you, don't accommodate that. Kick it out. Kick it out of your mind, kick it out of the village. That doesn't belong here. And you're not to accommodate that into your schema. That's when we end up with fundamentalism. And I think what ends up happening when we negate that very process is we end up with basically like a desiccated interiority that is not any longer, you may be able to call it still within the bounds of automaticity, but because it negates problematicity, it is no longer capable of self-saturation. Because you have to remember, at least in freak theoretic terms, the very process which creates saturation or creates a sense of interiority necessarily produces an excess product which is external to the interiority. And that excess product necessarily then engages in its own dialectic. And those moments are those moments of you can experience it in the sense of like an aha. I'm working, I'm doing this thing. I'm in the interior, I'm in the flow, I'm in the zone. And all of a sudden I hit a limit and there's an excess product of that limit, and it's this idea. I'm like, ah, there it is. And then I start working with the idea, and I'm working with the idea, and then that becomes its own saturated state, beyond which it becomes inert, and a new idea forms. And I'm no longer even really interested in the previous idea because it's now automatic, it's second nature, it's just like riding a bicycle. I don't think about it. So when we don't, so that's why I just want to say that there's a difference. I think the difference between the sort of automaticity which represents the fundamentalists in some, I've never been a fundamentalist, so I'm really like sort of imagining what it's like, but really when I put myself in a fundamentalist position and I'm constantly trying to evade problematicity and negate prediction errors, that actually doesn't sound very automatic. It sounds rife with neurotic preservation and concern. So
I have a thought when you're speaking about fundamentalism, is that we are all automatic. Like, we don't want to pretend that we're not, because we are fundamentalists, you know, on some level. We have our givens, right? And we operate through that. But the difference
I don't
is,
like the idea of conflating automatism, which of course we are, with fundamentalism. I'm just not sure that they. I guess I can you. So you mean on even the most micro level? Like,
I'm thinking of Gurdjieff when you're speaking, right? And Gurdjieff would say we go from do, re, mi, and then there's a shock, right, to get to the next part of the octave. And then there's also a shock at the end. Like, there's 8 different, you know, there's 2 different major shocks in the whole musical scale, and it's very automatic to go from do to re, and then but getting to the I don't know if I'm expressing this well. Getting to the next part is a shock to the system, right? So most people remain in the kind of early automatisms and remain kind of mechanical, and we're all very mechanical, and like. What Gurdjieff would say is that we have to realize how completely fundamentalist and mechanical and running on automatisms we are before there's any possibility of our, you know, liberation from that, is what I'm saying.
I mean, and we might have the whole thing backwards. I mean, like, you know, we talk about marriage a lot. Like, let's say you say, you and me, we're going to be together forever. That's a fundamentalist position.
Yeah.
You're not going to be with anyone else. I'm not going to be with anyone else. But as we've discussed, when you create boundaries and then you continue to repeat, those repetitions are not actually redundant because time is progressing. And so that the automatism of, like, you know, you and me are going to be together all the time, you're constantly encountering problematicity because you're suppressing desires, or you're getting into an argument, or whatever the case. But if you stick it out, you end up with an excess product, which is the resolution of that, or a new stage of development in the process of the relationship. And so, you know, I hesitate to even say that the fundamentalist enclosure does not itself undergo innumerable sublations and excess products, which then continue to heighten the sort of saturated interiority of the, you know, whatever that enclave is. Let's say from the outside, we're like, wow, that's really fundamentalist. But from within its interiority, it still, of course, must be coming into contact with problematicity. It's just that those problematics are interior to its interiority. It's like relational problematics. It's like, I'm upset with my mother, this happened. But because they keep repeating the same process over and over, they're of course going to end up with saturation points that continue to sublate and continue to add sort of layers of richness.
So it's a never-ending process. There's not one point where, you know, you know, you might be a point where you move beyond fundamentalism, but even within the fundamentalism, there's still a process going on where you're banging against, let's say, these shocks or these saturation points, as you might call it.
Yeah, I mean, and I have to just presume that when you do encounter, you know, when a fundamentalist, whatever, encounters some prediction error that's not meant to be adopted or accommodated, it can still be accommodated as bad. You know, oh, that goes in bad category or evil or whatever it is, and so. anyway, I for some reason this issue of automatism and fundamentalism is endlessly sort of interesting, because I think within it is a very interesting problem with regard to belonging, and we're constantly, as Westerners, of course, like, how do we evade fundamentalism? Well, maybe you don't. Maybe actually you totally embrace it, and
You go through it, maybe.
Yeah, maybe you go through
Maybe
it.
we all have a fundamental, like, I know, in my own personal journey, feeling quite triumphalist about my own particular religious practice path. And then I kind of grew out of that and started exploring other ones. I think that happens to people in whatever domain they're in.
Yeah, and it's embarrassing in hindsight, but it always happens, and it's usually when you're just fresh on the track of something. It's like, oh, I'm newly, this religion is my thing, and the old people that have been in the religion for a long time can't stand you because you're the young fundamentalist, because it's so new to you. But after you work through it, you end up with a saturation point, and the excess product of that saturation is that you don't take it quite as seriously, or whatever the case. So working through these fundamentalist positions seems to be an important part of adopting and even of knowledge acquisition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jump in there, Daniel.
No, all absolutely outstanding. So there's a few things that come to mind. Fundamental,
Like a fundamentalist, if I'm basing it on like James Hunter, his book on evangelicism, where he's talking about before the shooting begins, a fundamentalist would be someone who believes that their worldview is a description of the fundamental tenets of reality, and that everyone else is wrong. If you do not hold, say, Christianity, then you are simply wrong. And actually, because you are wrong, it would actually be good for me not to listen to you, because anything you say could only do one thing: make me wrong versus right. So everyone does have to have true givens, biology, and you also have to have axioms. You can't avoid having axioms because, you can't have. Now, the problem is, after Gödel, we know we cannot be sure that those axioms are objectively grounded. Yet, nevertheless, you have to make, dare I say, leaps of faith or absolute choices or assumptions, operating assumptions, right? You have to have those. But an operating assumption that is, say, an open operating assumption, which I think philosophers are trained in, is the ability to have confidence in a position, but that confidence not be in an avoiding of encounter. In fact, you're very open to encountering and actually strengthening the position, or actually moving it, because you're committed to, dare I say, the truth, to use a fancy phrase. You're committed to what is actually the case, but you also learn that your good ideas often get in the way of what is actually the case. So this is where I think the true philosopher requires encounter. They require otherness and difference, actually, for the blossoming of their
shock
thought.
and difference, and the destruction of sometimes of their precious models, right?
Absolutely. What becomes given is the creative destruction of models, and you come to find belonging in the process of that creative destruction of models and that ever opening and closing and different things. So a fundamentalist, again, and I'm thinking of this term more as kind of a sociological term. So a way to kind of picture this is a fundamentalist is someone who's playing checkers. And there are lots of problems in checkers. You can have lots of things and strategies you have to figure out. The philosophical moment is when somebody comes along and says, hey, life actually isn't checkers, it's chess. So suddenly, the very fact you're playing checkers could be a problem. In addition to the problems and strategies and tensions of the game of checkers, now you have a new problem, which is the introduction that you may be wasting your time on checkers and have to actually go learn an entirely new game called chess. Oh my gosh, I don't even want to play games. I don't even want to do it anymore. It's too much. Well, that's the nihilist. That's when you don't commit to anything, right? And that's basically the age that you could say defines some of the 20. Oh, you could refer to that as the nihilist. What happened is people found out that the board game in which they were learning strategies of problematization or figuring out, like, so for example, if you're a Christian, you are given strategies of how to deal with personal relationships, right? And you learn those and you learn how to deal with problems within those strategies. And then one day you find out that entire rule book, if you will, that entire game of dealing with problems itself could be wrong, which is a new problem on top of those problems. That is this like super, dare I say, macro problematization that occurs with the philosophical moment. But in that occurring, there becomes the possibility of then when the guy says, hey, do you know life is actually chess, not checkers? Now is the possibility for saying, I know that is possible, and yet nevertheless, I am going to continue to commit to checkers. Well, that's crazy. You're drunk. What are you doing? And yet there's something that is monk-like about that, right? Like the knowledge of knowing that reality could be chess, and yet nevertheless, you are going to continue operating according to checkers, but also not closing off people from sitting around you who think you should be playing chess or Monopoly, because that's global pluralism. You let them sit around and watch you play checkers, and actually you speak to them and you interact with them, and yet you nevertheless continue to operate within checkers, but maybe you adjust a little bit. Maybe you say, okay, well, checkers, but let me try chess a little bit. Okay, but I'm going to go back to checkers. You become much more fluid, right? But you know that checkers could be wrong. That's really difficult. And yet, nevertheless, you absolutely choose it. Nevertheless, you continue to operate within that problematization.
That's a kind of schizophrenia of fundamentalism, right? Is that
There
you
is,
know,
yeah,
some,
we call it falsely deludes,
something
yeah.
is, you believe, you have these set of axioms and beliefs which you doubt, but you hold on to at the same time, which drives you into insanity. I've seen that happen to people.
But that is the costly deludes. Like we talk about costly deludes. And for me, that though is precisely the state that for belonging again to be possible, you have to have people trained and able to handle. Well, that sounds like madness and impossible. Admittedly, that sounds impossible. We know it's possible. There are random individuals that seem to be doing it. But the question is, can you scale the conditions of incubating that at a larger scale? Now, that's running into the 4 arrows problem of the leopard code, possibly oppressing people, et cetera, so forth. So that's a big, big issue. But basically, that is what you're describing. The other thing I was going to say to Mr. Ebert's point quickly on this notion of, like, once you think about being a fundamentalist now, that seems really stressful. That is actually the logic of historic advancement, if I will. You know how, and the way I would describe that, you know the FedEx sign? I always use it as an example because I love the FedEx sign example. You know how there's a arrow in it made of negative space? Remember when you couldn't see that arrow? Remember when you didn't see it, and no matter how long you saw it, you couldn't see it. And then one day somebody said, or you saw the arrow in it. It basically becomes impossible not to see the arrow now. And actually, it would take an insane amount of work to make it invisible to you, right? Like, how do you even do that? That's just stressful, right? So what's funny enough is there's a true progress. And I do think basically this is Hegel's kind of notion of how progress works. It's like seeing the FedEx arrow. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Nabokov talks about that at the end of Speak Memory. I really like that example. But once you, in a funny way, to use a religious term, there's kind of grace in this. Like, you don't have to worry about never again not seeing the arrow. Once fundamentalism becomes stressful to you, great. You don't have to worry about the banality of evil anymore. There's a grace in that. Oh, but grace is fire too, because now you have to worry about nihilism, not having roots, and being alienated from everyone around you. So you get a new problem, but you don't have to worry about falling back on the old problem, but you still got a new problem. So there's a kind of Dante-esque movement there as a result of seeing something that then you can't imagine not seeing it or going back. That's now stressful, which means you keep going forward. But then what's really funny? Seeing that arrow was always there. This is, I think, the key logic to history in a way. That arrow was actually always there. Fundamentalism, as I'm describing it sociologically, always had this abysmalness to it. It always did, but you didn't see it until you did. And then once you did, you couldn't unsee it. And now that you can't unsee it, there's a kind of forceful push of history to advance, or you have to fall back to being a guy trying to not see the arrow on the sign, trying not to pretend like you didn't hear a guy tell you that life could be chess instead of checkers, right? And that leads to all sorts of problems. So now the issue is, okay, there's a grace in like being in a place where you realize you can't go back to fundamentalism and it not be stressful, but that also presents a new challenge. But this is also why spreading the conditions of the possibility of people seeing the arrow should not be taken lightly, because the moment people see it, they can't unsee it. And who knows what happens then? They may explode, right? This is why political projects of accelerating the seeing of the arrow, like Mr. Ebert, like we talked about in our talk, and then I'll close, there's this participation in the saturation, like helping it, like participating in occurring, but not getting ahead of it in freak theory. There's a helping it reach the saturation where everyone sees the arrow, and then that can have the possibility of the things we're describing. But here's the problem. Once you see that invisible arrow, it's really hard to then kind of humbly participate in the gradual process of people seeing. What you want to do is be an evangelist. Go out and say, don't you see the arrow? Don't you see it? Don't you see? Don't you know that checkers could be chess? Well, now you have pathologies. Now you have all these sort of problems. So this is where James Hunter talks about the logic of history. And he wrote this wonderful book called To Change the World, which basically just goes through and asks, how does the world change? Now, this is a long book, and there are many exceptions to this argument, but what he really, I think it really aligns with freak theory to close the point. And then I was thinking about the monk and drunk thing, but I'll pause because there's something important in that to be added. But the point is that James Hunter says that basically changing the world requires a kind of faithful presence, not getting caught up in the kind of back and forth or the kind of emotional, tell everyone about the arrow. You say, you've seen the invisible arrow. Okay, now be faithfully present to that arrow. As people come to you, as people are ready to see it, you are faithfully present to being there to help spread it. And you also work on the conditions so people can reach you per se, but you do not try to run out and change the world to see it, because that could have unintentional consequences because you're introducing it too soon. You're introducing chess too soon. You're introducing a different alternative too soon. And basically what you can say is that the world today is increasingly, on average, seeing that arrow without the political economy or the socioeconomic conditions to handle that realization, or to be able to find other people who can help them relate to seeing that arrow that they can now not unsee, and thus belonging becomes a problem.
It's kind of the loneliness of, it's like the loneliness of being at a higher stage that, and the people around you are not in that stage that you've found yourself in, so you get stuck in the in the chess by yourself, playing chess with yourself, and I think a lot of people are kind of in that place where, like, they've seen the what's false about fundamentalist religion, but they haven't found the next thing yet. So they're just people are just stuck in this in between worlds place, which is very interesting. But it's very alienating and lonely, and kind of, it's the dark night of the soul as well.
Well, and I should just note quickly to Ebert's point, there was a time in history, like, where being a fundamentalist, because you didn't have global pluralism and you didn't have trade routes, you didn't have the internet, you didn't even know about the other, that in a sense there was nothing wrong with being a fundamentalist. In fact, you couldn't help it. Like, this is kind of the key. Like, what is fitting for a historic moment changes through history. And this is why I think it's very tricky, because, like, what ends up happening is being a fundamentalist per se, when fundamentalism isn't even a term, there's just the isness of Christianity in an isolated community in Europe that doesn't know about India. This is very different from trying to act like Christianity is the fundamental principles of reality while conscious of people in India and pretending like they don't exist and actually moralizing yourself as superior to them, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is where I think is tricky, and where I like the interiority language, because as, like, every higher state of consciousness brings its own terrors. Like, as you become aware of bothness and philosophy and freedom, you then face the new terror of that freedom. And the thing I would always want to emphasize is that every stage of consciousness, in a sense, is not necessarily better than other stages of consciousness, even if it might be more fitting for this historic moment. I make a distinction between kind of moral better and fittingness. Like, when you're playing baseball, the skills of baseball are more fitting than the skills of bowling, right? Does that mean the skills of bowling are worse than baseball? Well, it depends on the interiority. It depends on the game, right? There are so it goes with history. There are episodes of history where certain ways of thinking are more fitting given the moment of history, whereas in previous stages, another way could be all right. But what ends up happening now is you have another kind of means of consciousness that is fitting for global pluralism, but it necessarily brings with it the risk of what Hume, like, philosophical melancholia, loneliness, alienation, separation. But precisely because of that, it has the possibility of these new membranic communities that we're talking about that make possible belonging again that is not pathological. So everyone brings with it trade-offs, risks, challenges in different ways.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just was thinking about this in terms of scale, and also because you talk a lot about scale, and also in terms of I don't know the way you term it, but sort of rechilding the world. in the sort of Nietzschean sense. And then in the context of what we are talking about now, so the child, I'm just going to read from these notes I just wrote down. The child has a sort of transdeterminate relationship to reality, and I think that this is sort of what we're describing here, where we have and again, I'm going to reference these sort of two parts of the brain, the liberal and conservative part of the brain, right? The pattern matching, the sort of metaphorical part of the brain that's constantly seeing similarities between things, and then the part of the brain that's always seeing difference and always wants things to be sort of separate and preserved. And one sort of relates more to fundamentalist, and the other relates more to sort of adventurist. And we have both of these, and we're constantly oscillating in real time between these. Now, the adult, or let's say the child, the infant, to differentiate from the child, the infant has a sort of pathological approach, or I should say, a psychotic approach, where everything is mine. And the adult has this sort of inversion where they try and collect as much as possible to be theirs. But there's these very distinct rules regarding what's whose and what is what, and everything is very determinate. Now, in terms of like identity diffusion and things that are typically considered to be pathological, we now have a state of, mass identarianism, which is essentially to say mass fundamentalism, which is clearly neurotic. When you will not let go and even consider the possibility that checkers is chess, then you are clinging on to something, and you're probably clinging on to something because you don't want anything to change, and you probably don't want anything to change because you're afraid of death and so on, right? And so there's neurotic. But then you have so in a lot of ways, the adultification or the adult, the true, like adults, not adultification, but adults tend to fall into this more deterministic camp, where determinate relationships are what define the adult. And it's just gotten to a sort of conversation with Zach Stein, vis-a-vis, email yesterday, I think. And we were talking about neuroses, and he said something like, well, this can't just mean whatever you want it to mean, it blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And he actually brought up identity diffusion. But then I brought up, well, identarianism, which is sort of the opposite of identity diffusion, where you're like, this is me, and I know my place, and this means that. And propaganda, for the Consilience Project, has put out these good papers on propaganda, but I had been like, well, you should also say, that you are or could be considered to be propaganda yourself, and not sort of say, no, propaganda has a very specific meaning, and it means this, and we're not propaganda because of this. And transhumanists are bad. Okay, well, what is transhumanism? Where did that age start? Are we forgetting the device paradigm? Are we arguing against McLuhan, the extensions of man? Are they not transhumanist? And when we use the products that transhumanists develop and put out, are we transhumanist when we're using them? Like, am I a transhumanist right now because I'm using this computer and so on? It's like, well, you're fucking with all my definitions, right? And now when we think about like your definition of fundamentalist, and it's an approach which says this is the only truth that describes reality, well, we could break that back down into simply use of language as opposed to a religion, and be like, well, this word means this word means this, and in my language, my orientation to language, which is, in a postmodern sense, my orientation to reality itself, is distinct, and I know what this word means, and I know what this word means, and so on. Well, then, essentially we're fundamentalists, and what philosophers are always doing is creating neologisms and so on, and messing with language, and inspecting and essentially creating problems for everyone, for everyone's grasp of reality. Now, the child is sort of like, and the child in the Nietzschean sense seems to be so. have a transdeterminate relationship where the infant is indeterminate with regard to its grasp of language, its grasp of boundaries, of limit, of what's his or theirs or hers and what isn't. It's all theirs. Right? As one big interior, it's psychotic. And you have to constantly keep telling them, no, no, no. I mean, this is a big, you know. And of course, psychotic parents these days are told never to use the word no. Right? I mean, we're being taught to raise our kids as in the state of psychosis and go with psychosis. And so parents are becoming psychotic and essentially becoming children. And but not in the sense that I'm about to describe. And so the child, the infant, you know, the sky can be cotton candy, right? But then the adult is like, no, no, it's not cotton candy. It's a fucking refracted ionosphere and so on. But the Nietzschean child somehow has a balance between the two, in which one thing can mean another thing, and the definitions are not static as previously assigned. However, as you said, you can choose to still like chess or still like checkers. And that you can say, well, yeah, sure, but after investigating this, either yes or no. Through investigation, I you know, decided one thing or the other, and I made the irrational choice to say yes to this or no to that, and so on. And so that the rechilding of the sort of adult population would have something to do with confronting the determinate relationship of the adult to language. Forget even the adult to their religion or the adult to their job or the adult to language. Yeah. And I think this is happening in an interesting way, obviously, vis-a-vis the woke movement and sort of especially the pronoun situation. And you see the incredible neurotic repulsion from even considering that pronouns you might even use an inclusive pronoun, or that her might mean a particular kind of her that you previously didn't anticipate. Talk about a fucking prediction error, right? And that they don't want to accommodate. Now, because they're refusing to accommodate it, that's fundamentalist. But if you go through the problematic and you work through it and you accommodate it, but you accommodate it in your own way, you work through it, you get to a saturation point, you come out on the other side of it, having dealt with it, and then you form an opinion, or then you say, okay, yes, this and that and whatever, and my reality is not disturbed, my sense of self is not disturbed by these determinate reshufflings, because I am, after all, a transdeterminate being in the first place. Then I think we end up in a state where we are essentially sublating the determinate neuroses of adulthood and the indeterminate psychoses of the infant into the transdeterminate sanity of the sort of overmen.
Magnificent.
Yep. Go ahead, Jen.
Absolutely magnificent. So everything you said is tremendous. And basically, to cut to the chase, the transdeterminacy, as so described, is the only way to avoid the mass equilibrium that is leading to the suboptimal result on a global stage that is manifesting in either bifurcation, global problems, falling birth rates, or all different things. Transdetermination is a form of thinking of which is the only way to avoid various game theory dynamics. And the great horror is people are studying game theory to say, oh, this is how we be really determinate. Actually, this is how we be really neurotic, when it should be the revelation of the need to something like transdeterminism. So to explain. Also, what you were saying about language is exactly right, and why the book will really emphasize the two main categories of rhetoric and discourse, and basically say that if you look at human civilization, then if everyone is talking according to discourse, we can think about the Frankfurt School, all these people saying that the subject is structured by language. I would associate that with Kafka. And I think Kafka is much better than Orwell and Huxley, not that there's no good to that, because in Kafka, oppression is a result of your own consciousness structuring reality towards you in such a way that you end up oppressed, you end up in a little fable, you end up like a dog in a conspiracy and the investigations of a dog trial, all of these things. Kafka is the great thinker of game theory dynamics that is a result of the discourse that people are captured in that they cannot escape, and thus they are determined toward an oppressive result. Rhetoric, as McCloskey talks about, is the way of thinking that actually creates wealth, increases freedom, leads to a certain child versus the infant. That is really what leads to these massive paradigmatic shifts in history that Hunter is talking about with the faithful presence. So that's exactly right. So a way to look at it is you could say that the infant starts in babble, kind of babbling, if you will. Then the adult goes into language. And what we need to move into is something like apprehension, or the ability to apprehend. There's a silence in this ability to actively apprehend. Like you were saying, for example, this kind of tendency to say, no, this is what propaganda means, and this is what it means, and this is what transhumanist means. That is neurotic. The child who's babbling, there's no meaning, right? Because they're babbling. But in that babble, they have belonging, because they don't have any standards they have to meet. There's an indeterminacy. They're free. There's a kind of indeterminacy, right? So then to move into meaning, you need language. But that runs the risk of the neurotic and the determinate. And that's usually where everyone gets stuck. And that actually is where the world is stuck, basically, in this determinacy. And it's like, well, let's just go back to Babel then. No, that's not going to work. Or let's look at it like with Derrida. Like when Derrida says deconstruction is about justice. And to sum it up, I think it works very well with this language schema. When Derrida says, how do you know that the word cat actually equals the signified of cat? There's this gap between the signifier and the signified, right? And he basically wants to say that you can never cross that gap. Therefore, he's basically saying metaphysics is over. Because if you can never move from a phenomenon, an idea of a phenomenon to the phenomenon, if you're always going to have difference and difference and all of that, then the game is over, right? What he realizes is that language that is overly determinate is oppressive. But you see, here's the problem. If you end the conversation there, and he's adamant, deconstruction is about justice. He's justice, because language and the neurotic, the determinate creates injustice, right? It creates this sort of forcefulness. But here's the problem. Derrida, I think, basically suggests that silence is transdeterminism. That mere silence is transdeterminism, or going back to about. It is not. And actually, there are many theologians that make this mistake. What you need actually is more so the ability to flow with terms. You know that the word cat can never equal the signifier of cat, but you're able to move through languages, not be silent, but move through languages. Or the ability to, when I say the ability to pay attention to the conversation, to apprehend what the person means when they use the term. But that requires an encounter that you're adapting to live in the conversation that is transdeterminism, that is the capacity to avoid the suboptimal results of the neurotic, that is also the kind of thinking that makes possible belonging again, as opposed to belonging that is regressive. But that flies in, because basically the argument I have for Derrida is where I say, yes, Derrida, you're correct. The metaphysics of the gap is no longer possible. The metaphysics based on the crossing of the signified and the signified. But guess what, Derrida? There was actually an initial apprehension of, that is a cat. That is the basis for thinking now, the initial act of apprehension. Once I ask you, how do you know it's a cat? A gap opens up that you cannot cross. But you did apprehend that was a cat. The initial apprehension. I call it the difference between, if I put a bunch of scrambled words, I got a T, I got an A, and I got a C, and they're all scrambled up. There's a moment where when I adjust them and it spells cat, you go cat, and you apprehend it. That happens. But if I ask you, what's the definition of a cat? Well, now we fall into the difference. But the initial apprehension was there. That is transdeterminism. That is what you're doing in conversation. But what ends up happening is when people become neurotic about language, they destroy the apprehension. They say, no. You have to apprehend things like me. You have to apprehend things in my language. And if you don't, that's a problem. And that then leads to game theory dynamics that are like Nash equilibrium and all sorts of things.
Just adding one thing here before pass it to Alex. I've been thinking about this business of inversion and the fact that left, people who are traditionally left are now going right, and people who, and for me, that then right and left kind of lose their meaning. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, except if it's kind of a fashion. And if it's a fashion, I distrust it on some level. But maybe that's my, because I'm a little older, and I know that young people are very into fashion, and that's a whole creative exploration, which is cool and wonderful and everything. But I distrust it. Like, I distrust it if there are no actual givens of what something is, and we can just say that, okay, now we have to be right wing because that the moment now requires us to be right wing, whereas in the 90s, it would be cooler to be left wing. Is my query or question clear here? Or
Yep.
I think
Yeah,
they're both determinate. They're both neurotic still in a sense. They're not moving
Yeah.
to the transdeterminate. But please, Mr. Ebert.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I agree.
Yeah. So just to say that transdeterminacy is more or less only apprehendable as a historical sort of meta-narrative of how things work when you allow yourself to encounter limit and grow and change. In other words, transdeterminacy is not necessarily how things are working in the present phenomenology of the subject, although it could be, but primarily what transdeterminacy requires, or is a description of, is the swing between, or the oscillation between determinate and indeterminate. And unless you're willing to go from determinate to straight up indeterminate, straight up, I don't know, straight up, I'm lost, I'm confused. If you can't get to that point, then you can't ever essentially exist as a transdeterminate creature.
Because you're always captured, right, by something.
Yeah, because you're unwilling to experience the crucible
Yes.
Nice.
through which transdeterminism effectuates itself, which is the indeterminate moment.
Yes.
So that moment, and by the way, that moment we experience these moments all the time. That moment happens all the time. An experience of awe is indeterminate. Experience of awful is indeterminate. An experience of the moment of a problematicity, the moment of a prediction error, is momentarily indeterminate. But if we can't move into and through the indeterminacy, we'll never end up on the other side of it. The other side being a description of transdeterminacy, meaning having gone from determinate through the indeterminacy and into a new recognition or a new understanding. And so in that sense, just to say that it's not like transdeterminacy presents a solution that allows us to avoid indeterminacy. Rather, it's a description of the movement from determinacy into indeterminacy and back and so on. Yeah. And those layers of understanding where our knowledge acquisition grows, the stack of sediment, sort of very, sediment in a really sort of actual determinate sense, where it's like unmoving, inert sediment. This means that actually stacks and grows and creates a sort of a cross-sectionality of human, just like the cross-section of a cliff or of a tree, which shows its wisdom not in the absence of falsehoods, but in the presence of so many stacks of falsehoods, so many stacks of understanding, having gone through so many iterations of deterministic meaning, that one now has a transdeterministic view of meaning.
Absolutely. Magnificent. And I'll just say that that's exactly right. Transdeterminism cannot be a thing that you think. It has to be a situation you choose to put yourself in and be surprised by. Like, because that's where, like, the only way to move, like I'll talk about from the algebra of Descartes to the geometry of Leibniz, is what Leibniz is saying is basically the only way to think is geometrical, but the human brain doesn't do that. So what are you going to do? Like, we naturally have to think in points, because even if we think like a triangle, you're thinking a point of a triangle that's not surprising you. A way to put this again is transdeterminism must surprise you. And you cannot surprise yourself. Like, you can't, in a sense, like, think something. The only way you surprise yourself is to be in a situation that results in something emerging in you that you're surprised you find in you. It's this weird thing that in certain situations you can surprise yourself, which shouldn't be possible. And yet it is, but you can't just do it. Like, I can't, like, right now say, I'm going to surprise myself. Like, it doesn't work that way. I could say, I'm going to think of a cat. I'm thinking of a cat. I'm going to surprise myself with an idea of a cat. Doesn't work. But you can suddenly, just like in a conversation like this, constantly you find yourself saying things you didn't know you were going to say. There's a kind of surprising that occurs. And yet once the surprise occurs, it's like it's not a surprise. It's the weirdest thing in the world. Well, that's kind of transdeterministic. That's determinist and indeterminist at the same time, and yet neither, right? It goes to the monk and drunk example, which I think about a lot, because There's a sense in which you can't be a monk is if you can't equally at the same time possibly be a drunk. And if people clearly see you as a monk, you're no longer a monk. Like, that's the weird, I think about the status anxiety, I think about the cool stuff. The moment it's cool to be a monk, it's not a monk. The moment it's like, you know, there's status in being a monk, it's not a monk. You have to maintain the Schrodinger's cat position of bothness, which is not possible algebraically, only in situation and relation.
So the
right?
monks are really a pure hedonist on some level, like a total hedonist, you know, at heart.
Yeah.
That's why he would become a monk, you know, otherwise, because he'd be so overwhelmed by his own hedonism. And this, and, you know, it's often the case. I've met monks, I've lived with monks, and it is often the case that they are extreme hedonists who have found it necessary to impose a limit on their lives so that they can just you know, be more function and go in a direction where they're not just you know, thrown around by the wind.
The true mystic, like, you'll see so many of these statues of some of like the Christian mystics, they're like having an orgasm, because the beatific vision and the mystical, all they want is the bliss, which is this radical pleasure, but they know the way that that is accessed is some sort of limitation that may sacrifice social recognition, and in that you achieve precisely like a saturated state of bliss that is pure pleasure, and yet it's an is ought together kind of state. And that is also, to me, auto mastery, because like on this idea, like you can be, there's the avoiding of prediction error that is simply the result of a stable environment. Like, you make sure nobody throws a punch at you, for example, like I'm thinking Bruce Lee or something. Then there's someone throws a punch at you and now you're thinking, oh my gosh, I need to train because I now realize the world is dangerous, but now you're in a like error and you don't belong. But then there's the belonging of no matter who throws a punch at you, you're prepared for it and it doesn't disturb you because you can block it, right? That sort of state where it's the movement from planning to preparation that we talked about in the Ivanillic. Like, we have a world where everyone's planning to make sure bad things doesn't happen. Belonging, again, is about being prepared for bad things so they don't disturb your belonging, which sounds impossible and crazy. But that is what it would mean to belong again, where the indeterminacy is part of the determinacy in the situation of transdeterminacy. And then if it does disturb you, like truly deeply disturb you and becomes a true prediction error, it doesn't like deconstruct you. You know how to go back. You know how to do the work again. And that's the new process of a freak theory. That's the new thing. But all of that is a meta, dare I say, a way the subject has to see themselves in relation to the world. All of what we have been describing in this conversation, in a sense, is an idea, right? It's a schema. It's an idea of how you can live your life. Well, spreading, can you spread the people that know this idea? Can you spread the conditions that teach this framework of operation? Because the argument I would like to make is that if you can, and you can create the institutions that can, dare I say, habituate or have people even think these things, then the probability of avoiding global game theory, Nash equilibrium, various forms of self-destruction go down. Nothing is guaranteed, of course, but if you can actually have people realize transdeterminacy as so described as a commitment to a situation that possibly surprises you, that you work to be prepared for, so that you can enjoy the flow and beauty and dance of it and come to enjoy that as a child versus an infant, if you can spread the conditions of which incubate that on average for the average person, you thus start avoiding some of the Nash equilibrium that are defining the global stage. And so those would be, what would that look like? And it has a lot to do with language, a whole lot to do with actually making things linguistically based and training people to be able to not be neurotic about language, to flow with language like a hip hop cipher. That becomes a symbol, like the cipher mentality that Bernard Hankins talks about. The ability to kind of work in that improvisational space becomes, improvisation is also like, just like this conversation, then I'll close the point. There is something fundamentally transdeterminist about a conversation like this, because you don't know what you're going to say ahead of time, and yet you're prepared for it. You're prepared to not know what you're going to say ahead of time. You're prepared. That's an indeterminate. You know you're going to go into a conversation. There's a determinate structure. You know you're going to talk. You know about the topic, but you have no idea where it's going to go. So it's fluctuating between the indeterminate and the determinate, right? But this kind
and
of
all
conversation,
your planning, it just, you know, all the planning that you had for the conversation just falls away, and the scaffolding kind of.
And weirdly, you needed the plans.
You have to do the planning.
You needed the plan so something could fall away. This is the weird thing. You have to do the planning so that there's a difference between never having a pen, clutching a pen, and dropping a pen. The hand that drops the pen is not the same as the one that never held one, right? So the transdeterminate that moves back into indeterminacy from the determinate is not the same as the individual that just stayed in the indeterminate. That would be the infinite. So the ability to move, which is negation, all these things, that becomes a characteristic of the transdeterminate, which then, to close the point, must be geometrical. It must be situational. It must be an encounter, because that's the only possibility of limit to have this transdeterminate activity occur. So then the question is, what does a politics, an education, a society, a community, et cetera, so forth, infrastructurally look like to increase the probability of transdeterminacy on average for people? And those would be the questions of then moving into the political, the economic, et cetera, so forth.
So any thoughts, Alex? We've been going for 2 hours. I never like to end things. I'm kind of like bad that way. But
It's been a lot of fun. I always enjoy this.
Fundamentalist.
there's so much ideation. My brain gets kind of like, how do I I feel like you're planning all this language in my mind, and it will take some time to. It always takes a bit of time to digest it, and then it becomes actually a part of my vocabulary in some kind of way, and I can dialogue with it more smoothly without going into my own language, because I'm crisscrossing my own language of these things with your language and my own. Because like, for example, when you were talking, I was thinking about spiritual practice. When you do it, it's very repetitive, and then it's a kind of a preparation, but it's very boring, right? In many ways. And then you have an opening, and then that's like what it's all for. But the preparation, the practice, the work, is not necessarily something that is very attractive, or it really means going against your habituation, going against your automatisms, and so there's a struggle that's going on all the time. So that was what I was thinking about when you were speaking.
Well, I would just say that freak theory provides a basis to think that operating in language in the way you just described, this ability to move out of your language but not give up your language, that freak theory provides a basis to believe that art of language is justified. Because if reality has that way of, like, if you stick in a language, it becomes its opposite, then the ability to flow becomes the correct art form that you want to actually engage with in order to work in the transdeterminate. So there's a theory of how language should operate that is undergirding this conversation, that freak theory, I think, represents and shows and legitimizes, that then is also legitimized by the historic account of where wealth comes from, how democracy is possible, how relations occur, which has a whole lot to do with a transdeterminate relation with language, which if we don't have, we slip into a discourse that structures like a character out of Kafka, where we end up unable to escape a hallway where we're heading toward a trap or a cat. The ability to move out of language, as you're describing, is absolutely, I think, historically, and then let me put it this way, and being faithfully present and committed to that art and space of language is precisely what, following Hunter, changes the world, brings about transformations and subjectivity that then avoid various forms of self-effacement. So I think that is just absolutely critical today. I appreciate what you were saying.
Yeah, and also, Andrew, what you were saying is a great description of the freak theoretical model, which is another way of describing the dialectic, but using the notion of saturation. So what you just described is you have to go through all of these periods of repetition. You're doing these, what you call preparation, but the preparation is boring. You just kind of repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. You do it, you do it, you do it, you do it, you do it. And at some unknown quantitative threshold, an opening, you described it, right? Yeah. Occurs. Now that opening is a result of a quantitative process of repetition, right? Which you called preparation. Now that preparation is quantitative by virtue of the fact that
you have to do a lot of it. In other words,
you have to do some amount of it, beyond which
you have to do a kind of an extreme amount of it to get very mastery of it.
Yeah, auto mastery.
You have to do a lot of it to become good at it.
Yep.
You have to
And
do
if
a
you
lot
do
of-
just a little bit, then you're just going to remain in the same mediocre.
Right. But not only that, like I'll just use the mantra as a good example. You have a word, talk about language. It means something. Let's say the mantra that you were given was notebook. And you're like, okay, what the fuck is this? My guru must be playing tricks on me. This means notebook.
Coca-Cola or something.
How is Coca-Cola going to create some sort of like transcendent experience for me?
Yeah.
Well, he tells you to just keep repeating it. So you sit there and you're like, okay, I guess I'm being punked, but I'll just do this. Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola. Now you repeat, you repeat, you repeat. Why do you repeat a mantra? Because there is a quantitative threshold beyond which the mantra kicks in and something opens. Now, what happens to the word Coca-Cola when that threshold is discovered? Because, by the way, the guru never says, say this 26 times. He'd be a bad guru. He says, just keep saying it till it happens.
Yeah.
Because you don't know when it's going to happen. But what does happen is that the word, and it could be any word, reaches a saturation.
I'm not sure I agree about it that it could be. I mean, it could be, but certain words have a particular psychoenergetic state, right?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. But what I'm describing can happen with any word, which is that you can take any word and repeat it enough times, and eventually a moment will occur beyond which the word has become momentarily indeterminate. It can be airplane, was an example that Daniel Garner once gave. It could be Coca-Cola. It could be eyeglasses. It could be anything. All of a sudden, what you thought was a determinate word suddenly becomes you don't know what. You oversaturate it, and it goes from determinate to indeterminate. There's a word for it. It's called semantic satiation.
Yeah.
Right. This is a very known phenomenon. But what I believe it actually is semantic saturation. So the going idea is that semantic satiation, your brain knows so well what it means that your brain stops paying attention to what it is, because you keep saying airplane and your brain is being triggered to be like, call the image of airplane. But eventually your brain is like, okay, I'm not paying attention to this anymore because it's not referring to anything real. So I'm going to stop paying attention. As soon as your brain stops paying attention, you're still saying the word, but you can't locate its meaning, its determinate meaning. But the other way to think about it, which I think is more proper, is that essentially what you've done is you've saturated the category. You've created such a dense relationality within that category and within such a small space of time, because you're repeating it over and over in a small span of time, that it saturates, becomes indeterminate. And that is the process. And then, by the way, you come out on the other side of it, looking back at airplane, your mantra, being like, I guess that word is a transdeterminate word after all. It doesn't just mean airplane, does it? Because if you keep repeating it to the point of indeterminacy, it does this other thing, which means that the word is transdeterminate, which means language is transdeterminate.
Well, it's interesting. Like, in yoga practice, you repeat it. You repeat. It's not just a mantra; it's also a visual image and a certain exercise, and it could be quite elaborate. And you keep doing that until you become the deity, like in a sense that your psychosomatic sense of who you are becomes that image which you've done to the point where you would walk by a mirror and you would not recognize yourself if it's done very extremely, right?
Right. Or it happens.
So this is what we do when we develop personality. We say, I am Andrew, I am this, I am that, I live here. We're always doing a mantra of who we are and creating this identity, right? And in a way, that whole process is about it's not an end process. It's not
the deconstructing process.
It's a process where we're deconstructing that particular identity to get to a higher level state of perception of reality.
Now I just want to
from checkers to chess, moving from a small-minded version of my own psychosomatic self to something else, and then we dissolve that, and it kind of just keeps going.
Yeah, and what I wanted to add to that is that if we look at the transdeterminate process that just described, we see a certain boundary limits. So we see the word or the image that you just described, or you're looking in the mirror, and there's certain constraints on a process which essentially constraints, if those constraints bound metaphysically the entire process, we're talking about an interiority that you're constructing just for a moment. And if we take that and we realize that repetition is totally crucial and essential to the movement from determinate to indeterminate, thereby repetition is entirely crucial for the transdeterminate process, on the far side of indeterminacy, where you have a new determinate understanding of the determinate thing, namely, oh my God, this thing isn't simply the thing, but it's also this other thing. Then what that means for belonging, or implies for belonging, is that the richest sorts of belonging are the very ones that do have constraints and which facilitate repetitious interactions. Now, all of a sudden, we're thinking, wait a minute, that sounds really claustrophobic. That sounds like it's not free. That sounds like it doesn't facilitate my individualism and my ability to do whatever the fuck I want, whenever the fuck I want, and to leave whatever relationship whenever, and to just say, okay, I no longer have this membership. I rescind it and I'm going to a new group, right? And the whole idea of like exodus and voting with your feet and so on, and leaving your country for another place and so on. Now, what I want to propose is that for anyone listening, if they're like, if I was to be like, well, what do we do? It's like, well, if you can locate your true givens as opposed to the institutional givens, and you feel that you have discovered an interiority, whatever that interiority is, but let's say it's a group of friends. If you've discovered an interiority that you believe satisfies your true givens, and you've discovered and manifested through the satisfaction of your true givens, then what you should do is stick with that interiority for as long as you can.
It's like a really good rock band or something, right?
Yeah. For as long as you can fucking stomach it, and then a little bit longer.
And a bit longer, yeah, that makes sense.
And then a little bit longer. Because what's going to happen is that through the negative interactions that will naturally occur through the repetitions of interaction, is that moments of indeterminacy will finally occur, beyond which the relationship will take on new and thereby enriched meaning.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that the idea of belonging, again, is especially beautiful because free of the institutional givens, in a world of total pluralism, where we feel free in a Western sort of sense to migrate to any given group and then leave it whenever we want, the very fact that we could leave the group that we've discovered through our true givens, and yet the fact that we do not itself enriches the membership. And then if you stick with those and you repeat the interactions, even if they may feel momentarily or for a very long time mundane, you can be guaranteed that those interactions will at some point reach a quantitative threshold beyond which it will take on new meaning and thereby enrich them.
And the mistake people make is backing out too soon. When things get ugly, or when things get difficult, or when there's a lot of static. I think that's always the mistake. But if you can keep going, then that kind of quantum leap that you're talking about can occur.
Yeah, and again, it has to be, you have to, though, it's not like, oh, stay in an abusive relationship,
No.
it'll be great. It's about, does this satisfy your true givens? And there's a certain advancement of mind that is required to even be able to locate your true givens, right? So this is advanced shit we're talking about. But if you can sense that these are satisfying your true spiritual givens, even for a week, and then after that week you're like, maybe not, stick with it. You have to trust in yourself on a certain level. Stick with it. Because even if the whole thing blows up, because again, we cannot determine the success of any given project by its duration.
That's right.
Totally.
We can't.
Nice.
Instead, we have to determine the success of it by how much we grew from it, So anyway.
Completely. And what everything you said is exactly what it means to belong again. Perfect. Because to me, I would align that with beauty, like the experience of beauty, and you get the ability to condition yourself to sense beauty, to sense that aura. And belonging, again, we'll talk about like reasons. One of the main reasons that people like leave communities too early is because they have the wrong ideas of forgiveness. They don't know how to talk with one another. They become neurotic about language. Like there are all these presuppositions that people have about signs that a community is good or not that get in the way of them sticking to it, so they can have that experience that you're talking about. And this is where, like, when David Hume talks about philosophy, he'd say the point of philosophy is far more to get the bad ideas out of your head that would make you leave early, per se, than it is about finding the right community. Because finding the right community, he puts more in the realm of, he'll talk about sympathy, but by sympathy, he doesn't mean like sadness. He means like this connection, this spiritual sense that there's something here that you're describing, where it's like that advanced sensibility. He's like, that is primary, not a philosophical definition of an identity. The philosophical skill is in service of that sensibility, but in order to get to that sensibility, you had to go through philosophy, which ran the risk of you never reaching that sensibility. But you have to go through that to be able to do what you're describing. And I think, like some other things, there's something inherent, there's all this talk about this need for sacrifice or commitment or ritual. All of what you're describing, where you choose to stay in the thing, has a sacrifice that then brings with it the possibility of a depth that is not possible without that choice. And that is now possible in this historic moment because of the increase of optionality that makes any option you pick seem arbitrary, which is precisely an option you pick and stick to can be all the more powerful. Like that is where global pluralism is an opportunity for beauty or absolute communities. There are different ways to languages that before was not possible because of the groundlessness of options that everyone is so crazy about is precisely the opportunity for what you just described. And belonging, again, is embracing that versus belonging like we did. Like there's a difference between belonging like we did and belonging again. And it's based on that beauty. And, like, one of the things when David Hume talks about natural laws that I think is often missed, when he says you can never from dropping a pen get to the natural law of gravity, what he's actually doing is trying to set up precisely the notion that miracles are possible. And what he means is like regularity is what makes possible the miracle of the surprise. Like the surprise, like we often think, like, let's put it this way. We think that the truest reality is the natural law. We say the law is the truest reality. I know Bard talks about habits and different things like that, but like the law, actually the law, the regularity is what's necessary for the miracle. Like you could say that we started history where it's just law, it's all just the infant, it's constant, and we're like, screw that, we want all miracle. But here's the problem: if it's all miracle, none of it's miracle. If it's all release, if it's all freedom, if nothing is constant, it's no good. The key is to say, no, I'm going to commit to a regularity so that surprise is possible. The surprise is more real than the regularity. The breaking of the natural law per se is more real than the law, but that requires the regularity. Beauty requires the regularity, because if there's no regularity, nothing can break through. And the breaking through is what's deep. The glimmer, we talk about the glimpse, the philosophy of the glimpse is actually more real than the regularity. But then you have to condition yourself and commit to the space where the glimpse is possible, which you're not going to do if you have the wrong idea. So you have to make the absolute choice, as we talk about, which, because of the groundlessness of pluralism, makes possible this more meaningful belonging that is chosen and found in a commitment that could be wrong. And because it could be wrong, and because it will be hard, and it's based on the encounter of difference, it has the possibility of a belonging that before was not possible. And so there's a sign of hope. We talk about the meaning crisis as a sign of hope today. These meaning, all this stuff that's going on is precisely what must be going on for the possibility of this kind of community that has something to do with that deep commitment that makes possible beauty. And then the last thing I'll say, there's emphasis on the transdeterminate. If you allow me to make an incredibly gigantuous claim, I think if you go through history, you actually see that the greatest moments of economic prosperity, what Sheldon Walden calls the democratic event, the greatest moments in politics have been the moments of transdeterminacy in history. So everything we're saying about this kind of emphasis on transdeterminacy, an economist or a politician may hear that and say, well, that's nice. That's great for your isolated community, but we're going to do the serious work of economic modeling and the serious work of politics. The hope of belonging, again, is to show that economics has always actually been at its best when it has incubated the conditions of transdeterminacy, that politics has been at its best when it's done so, and that actually very often We're still just surviving off the negentropy per se that was created by the transdeterminacy of the 1800s with the Dutch Empire, that we've just been living off the fumes for a long time, and the fumes are just rumming up. But if transdeterminacy in history has had this primary of a role in economics, politics, sociology, religion, et cetera, so forth, then to emphasize transdeterminacy is not only optimal for the individual subject or the individual community on a macro scale, it is also optimal. So belonging, again, will try to go through the history to show that in history, moments of trans events, there's that language of event, those events of transdeterminacy have actually been what made the world. And when we lose the transdeterminacy, you slip back into discourse from rhetoric, you slip back into the Nash equilibrium, you lose sight of the origin, you forget that, and then you get the suboptimal result of the great stagnation in economics that Tyler Cohn and all these, talk about. Keynes talks about it. So transdeterminacy. And then the other thing with transdeterminacy is, in the same way that everything can be beautiful, I think there's a way in which everything can be transdeterminate, like to the example of the speaking. If I look at that bookcase, like Cézanne the painter, and I look at it long enough, and I really look at it, it becomes something other than a bookcase. Like when you listen to music and you really listen to music, like really, 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 suddenly you're gone. Like when you read a book and it's really, really good. Like I think I mentioned this once. What started philosophy for me as a small kid I got in my bathtub. Yeah, I would get in the bathtub with a blanket and read the Redwall series. And I had this crazy moment where I realized, oh my gosh, there's a movie playing in my head and I'm not in this bathtub. I'm in Redwall. I'm in the Shire. I'm in this different place. How is that possible? It really freaked me out. And it's like, wow, the mind's able to do something crazy. That to me is another transitor. Like when you're so in the story, Redwall, with the words on the page, boom, you're in a movie, right? That is the basis of metaphysics. That's the basis of community. That kind of moment of transdeterminacy is what philosophy should be based on, that we should think, and then that has all these different effects. Like everything, when I hear everything can be beautiful, because there's that notion, everything has this potential of beauty. That is precisely found and realized in when one meets the conditionality of experience everything according to transdetermination, which must be geometrical, encounter-based, situational, and goes through a certain process of philosophical training. And then things can shine, like in that Hegel, so things can come forth in this different way, that then belonging can be found that has not historically been possible before. And so those, I think what Ebert was saying on the community today is exactly right and gets right at what belonging, again, wants to talk about.
Cool. Yeah. Oh boy, yeah, there's a lot there. That's really great. I really like also the idea of it's interesting. I've just been contemplating the fact that when you have a day and there's nothing to do in that day, what do you do with your day? It's very easy to get just swept away in the oceanic experience of the day, but it's very, if you had a job, you'd have to work from, a certain hour to a certain hour. And if I have a very chaotic life, and so I'm always trying to, I'm always trying to match my desire with a kind of a discipline. And so that's an intense struggle. It's different than just going to a job and working 9 to 5. And anyway, I'm starting to ramble here, but that's what this has made me think. Is like, what do you do with your day every day? What are you supposed to do? And so I think what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to orient yourself towards that in a very determined manner, that transdeterminacy or something like that, right?
Oh, I think you participate in the processes of the saturation. Like you participate in that moment of you have nothing to do, then really daydream. Like we were talking at the net between like this daydream, it's like really, really go into the boredom per se, the doing nothing. And suddenly the saturation of the nothing unveils itself in a new quality. But you would never think to do that if you didn't have the concept of transdeterminism. This is where ideas, I think, are like that once you say, hear a conversation like this, or you have that schema, that changes the conditions of possibility on a day where you have nothing to do. It then becomes possible to do those things. And so you see it, now you can do it, and it has that. But please, Mr. Ebert.
I was just going to say that, when you have nothing to do, you have to know whether or not you're referring to the institutional givens, like a job or whatever. Jobs tend to be institutional givens. You know, we count ourselves very lucky, those of us who found jobs that are a result of our true givens. But in the absence of the institutional givens, you languish in boredom until all of a sudden, you know, you discover and allow the true givens to kind of come forth. And as they come forth, you start following them, you start doing according to them, and then you start to encounter the constraints and limitations that, well, actually, you don't encounter the limitations until you reach a saturation point. You're like, oh, I'm doing the new given, whatever that new given. I guess I'm a pottery person now, and I'm making pottery shit because I no longer have these institutional givens, and this is something I'm somehow attracted to. And then there's a moment beyond which you're like, whoa, I must have exceeded some kind of quantitative threshold because I'm suddenly in the I'm sort of like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm in an indeterminate zone, and suddenly I'm like, oh, I guess I do know what I'm doing. And then now that I know what I'm doing, now I'm going to put this to some sort of use and reach another threshold, and then another threshold, and another threshold, and so on. And maybe I want to invent my own fucking clay throwing machine. Who the fuck knows where it goes? But if it's all this path of true givens, then you know, I think what we'll end up with, what would follow, of course, an epidemic of boredom, and hopefully that epidemic of boredom was preceded by, you know, robots doing all our work for us, and or some sort of UBI, and everyone's like, oh, but no one will have any purpose in life, and everyone will just die, and will experience behavioral sink, maybe, but we actually don't even know if that's the truth, because what might actually happen is that we all discover our true givens, and free to choose our own sort of spiritually mandated paths, we may discover that we are far more ambitious than we ever were.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure. Fantastic.
Oh,
no, I'm just wondering if we could, that is a nice way to round off the conversation. This idea of, you know, an aim towards and a contemplation of what is our true given, you know, and that's like a profound question that one could spend one's entire life just thinking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely agree, and it has been a complete joy to speak with both of you. To Alex's last point there, I think it's absolutely the case that if AI makes us, you know, does everything for us, we may find that our hunger for beauty is a lot greater than we thought. We may find that our willingness to read books that are useless is much more there than we realize. I think basically the human will find themselves in a situation where they'll be very hungry for infinite things. Like conversations like this are infinite, right? Like philosophy is infinite, beauty is infinite. Like you can always be better at a certain skill or different things. You can always have more community. We might find ourselves, you know, there was maybe Farrar or Lewis, they said the problem with the human beings is we're too easily pleased. You know, we haven't learned to elevate our pleasures like the mystic or different things. AI may actually unleash us to have finer pleasures, like things that, like we're saying, beauty or truth or these kind of conversations. It may free us in that way. The likelihood we are so freed, I think, increases the more that the ideas of, or the schema, the structure of a conversation like this is educated to people, that they are aware of it, that they would know to look into that unemployment, not as a evidence that they're screwed, but actually the space of experiencing a certain total saturation that would have them then open to these infinite things that we are so describing. And I think you can spread those conditions. I think you can open that up to people. I think the big thing, to me, just based on what you're saying, Mr. Ebert, is as more and more technologies emerge, like CRISPR or gene editing or all of these different things are going to allow people to basically then, you know, choose any givens they want, right? The ability to sense true givens and then to commit to them. The commitment is going to be so primary. Whatever you choose, give it the work and blood of your life.
It often, it doesn't matter what it is on some level, as long as you choose it and you don't just waffle, because it could become something else. You know, it could metamorphosize into some other thing. But if you commit and choose it, then you're probably on the right path, even if the thing you've chosen is completely, you know, off.
Yeah. And then, well, one thing I just wanted to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please, Mr. Ebert, please.
I was just going to say that, you know, the great indeterminacy of our time, of course, is the so-called meaning crisis, which is according to this conversation, and certainly according to me, not a crisis. It is the very threshold beyond which the transdeterminate magic happens. So it's to be embraced.
Yep.
And if we were, for instance, to experience an epidemic of boredom or an epidemic of this, that, and the other thing, it's quite possible that that is just something that needs to be seen again through the transdeterminate eye, on the other side of which is, of course, a vast new breed of industriousness that is spawned from the moment of or a period of indeterminacy. And any time we experience a period of indeterminacy, I think it's always going to be, or should be, from the transdeterminist point of view, viewed as a incredibly positive moment, at least with regard to holding meaningful process as a priority, because otherwise we really don't proceed. And so anyway, I just always like reminding us that this meaning crisis is not necessarily to be solved, but to be gone through, and in some ways to be intensified, with not a nihilistic approach of sort of desolation at the end of it, but with the approach of the transdeterminate enrichment of meaning in life and belonging on the other side of it. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, the thing I always like to stress is that we do know how to give meaning. Racism, xenophobia, anyone could do these things right now, closed-mindedness. The issue is that the people who are suffering a quote-unquote meaning crisis are doing so because they're holding themselves up to a higher standard. They're choosing not to go for those immoralities, or not to go to these old forms of belonging, right? In the metaphor I use is like Thomas More in the play A Man for All Season. He knows how to escape at any moment. He just has to grant the king the divorce, but he refuses to because it's against his standards, right? So in the meaning crisis is a sign of hope. It means that we're holding ourselves to a higher standard. Now, not everyone, but solving it means you solve the higher standard. You make it go away. So the meaning crisis is something you go through. And the key, like you're saying, in a world where everyone is bored or everyone doesn't have to, we have no idea, and then I'll close with it. We have no idea the kind of works people would do if they didn't have to work for money. We have no idea what kind of wealth or society might be created if people weren't forced to participate in the society there. Oh, and if you go through history, do you know when the greatest wealth is created? When people are not working for money, as Dietrich McCloskey talks about, when they're responding to the problems they encounter and trying to make them better. Invention, technology, economics. The big thing she screams that I think is exactly right. Economics grow when they're not trying to make money. They grow when they're trying to address what they encounter, which means inventions and technologies. What would the world look like if people were free to address what they encounter? They'd probably start off the first years bored and doing nothing, but eventually you'd reach, as Ebert was saying, the saturation point in the cave, and you'd say, I'm going to go do something. And who knows if they were free to address what they encounter, what the world would look like. And they would suddenly see significance in these things they encountered. That here's the trick: when they're working for money in the economy, they never have the opportunity to encounter, to find the call in, the work, the belonging, right? So we have no idea how people, like, there's no doubt that one of the reasons people don't want to talk about other worldviews or encounter pluralism is because they're exhausted with work. And they don't have time to think about their entire worldview because they got to be at work at 7 in the morning, right? Well, if people were free from that, who knows what they would do when they encounter. Now, we also have reason to see from Tocqueville, Louis Dumont, and other things that what people do when they encounter is get overwhelmed by anxiety, return to the neurotic, and all sorts of problems, right? But it doesn't have to be. It depends on people having the ideas that we're talking about now. It depends on people actually having the training to encounter that nothingness so that it becomes an opportunity. And these are the conditions that have to be spread. It is not given that when you do nothing, you won't have a geopolitical crisis, but it's also not given that you will. And we have to start talking as if it's basically the end of the world if this situation arises, because it actually could be the beginning of a beauty and a truth and a goodness and a kind of unleashing of the human spirit that we have not seen before. That is more likely if people are equipped with the thinking of a freak theory, of a transdeterminacy, and a focus on the encounter and a knowledge of the need for the commitment. And the hope is that more and more people will have that schema.
Fantastic. That was wonderful, and certainly put me in a good mood. So thank you guys. You guys are amazing. If you want to encounter Daniel in all his intensity and all his ideation and incredible optimism and and just thoughtfulness, come and join our course at Parallax. And great talking to you, Mr. Ebert. Thanks
Good to
so
be
much,
here.
you guys.
Yeah, that was a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Good
I
night.
enjoyed it immensely. I'm thrilled. And Alex, it's always a thrill to speak with you. Andrew, thank you for the
Likewise.
opportunity. It was a thrill to speak with you. I really enjoyed everything we got into, and we're looking forward to the class. Thank you both. Truly. Thank you.